Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The silver pen on the lawyer's desk, a gift from a firm grateful for his quiet diligence, began to vibrate. It was an imperceptible movement at first, a faint humming buzz that transferred from the polished mahogany into the very bones of his hand resting nearby. Gage looked up from the deed he was reviewing, his eyes narrowing at the quivering object. The afternoon sun, thick and golden with dust, poured through the high windows of the Portland office, and nothing else in the room was moving. No subway train passed deep beneath the building, no heavy truck rumbled down the commercial street outside. The pen simply trembled, as if trying to write a message from a world without paper. Then it stopped. He picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally so. A sliver of ice in his warm palm. He set it down carefully, a seed of unease, small and hard, planted deep in his gut. 2 days later, the seed had sprouted tendrils that wrapped around his ribs with every breath as he drove north. The firm had assigned him the Hendricks estate. Alistair Hendricks, a recluse of considerable and obscure means, had died without heirs in a remote coastal village called Cradle's End. Gage's task was simple. Inventory the property, the old house called the Eyrie, and facilitate its sale. It was a straightforward bit of solitude, a welcome respite from the city's clamor. But the drive felt less like an escape, and more like a slow, deliberate insertion into a different, older kind of silence. The lush green of the main coastline, seen by tourists as majestic, began to feel like a smothering blanket. The fir and spruce trees crowding the road were a dark, unbroken wall, and the glimpses of the ocean between them were the color of tarnished pewter. He arrived in Cradle's End as the evening fog was rolling in, swallowing the small cluster of clapboard houses and the single weather-beaten general store whole. The air was saturated with the smell of salt, pine, and the profound decay of things left too long in the wet. The villagers were a closed-mouthed lot. The postmaster, a man with eyes the color of the fog and a handshake like a dead fish, simply pointed a thick finger up the cliff road when Gage asked for directions to the Eyrie. At the general store, the woman behind the counter, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, took his money for a few groceries, and said nothing, her gaze fixed on a point just past his left shoulder. It was a collective silence, a held breath. They knew why he was here, and their knowledge was a palpable thing, heavy and cold in the damp air. The Eyrie was not a house so much as a growth on the cliffside, a gaunt, gray-shingled structure that seemed to have been extruded from the rock itself. It perched on the edge of the world, its windows staring out at the endless, churning Atlantic like the sightless eyes of a great beached beast. The key was heavy and iron, left under a moss-covered stone as per the instructions from the county clerk. The lock groaned, a sound of profound metal fatigue, and the door swung inward on hinges that screamed in a language of pure pain. The air inside was a century thick. It smelled of dust, yes, and salt, but also of dried flowers, of old paper, and faintly beneath it all, of wet stone and something else. Something coppery and organic, like the memory of blood. Gage's footsteps echoed on the wide plank floorboards, the sound swallowed by the oppressive stillness. The house was a museum of a life not lived, but endured. Furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, becoming a topography of ghosts. In the study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were crammed with volumes on nautical history, astronomy, and obscure metaphysics. It was here, in the dust-free rectangle on the massive oak desk, that he found the first of the ledgers. Alistair Hendricks had not been a mere recluse. He had been an archivist of the strange. The ledgers were not financial records, but journals, meticulously detailing phenomena. Page after page of small, precise handwriting noted times, dates, and descriptions. Fluctuations in barometric pressure coinciding with a perceived drop in temperature in the West Wing. The sound of dragging footsteps from the attic, always between the hours of 3 and 4 in the morning. A pervasive smell of ozone and brine in the second-floor hallway. And the reflections. Hendricks had written extensively about the reflections in the old speckled mirrors of the house. How sometimes they were not his own. How a woman's face, pale and drawn with an ancient sorrow, would appear behind him, her eyes dark pools of accusation. Gage read these entries by the guttering light of a hurricane lamp, the wind outside beginning to keen like a mourner. He told himself it was the fancy of a lonely, disturbed old man. The power of suggestion in a creaky old house. But the seed in his gut unfurled another tendril, and he found himself avoiding the dark mirrors in the hall. That night he was woken not by a sound, but by a sensation. The air in his bedroom had become solidly, impossibly cold. His breath plumed in the moonlight slicing through the window. And then he heard it, a soft, wet sound, a rhythmic slithering drag, like something heavy and soaked being pulled across the floorboards downstairs. It moved from the front door, through the hall, and paused at the foot of the stairs. He lay paralyzed, his heart a frantic bird beating against his ribs. The dragging sound began to ascend. One step, a pause, another. It was taking its time. It knew he was there. It was coming for him. The sound reached the landing, turned, and came down the hall toward his door. It stopped just outside. Gage stared at the sliver of darkness beneath the door, waiting for a shadow to block it. Nothing. Only the profound, waiting silence. And then the smell arrived. A wave of low-tide rot, of salt and bloated things, of kelp and deep, cold places. He must have fainted, or his mind, in its mercy, had shut down. He woke with the dawn, stiff and cold. The air was normal. The smell was gone. He told himself it was a nightmare, a product of reading Hendricks' madness before bed. But when he opened his door, the hallway floorboards were dry. And yet, a single crumpled piece of green seaweed, the kind found in the deep tidal pools, lay directly in front of his threshold. He went back to the village, his professional composure a thin veneer over a core of primal fear. He found an old man named Eli, mending nets on the dock, who seemed less hostile than the others, his fear worn smooth by time, like a sea glass. "The Eyrie has always had its tenant," Eli said, not looking up from his work. His fingers gnarled and strong, never stopped their lupine motion. "Hendricks' family, they built on a wrong place. They thought they owned the land, the sea, the sky. They thought they could bury their sins under stone and timber." "But what sins?" Gage asked, the wind whipping his words away. "Their name was Alara," the old man said, and the name hung in the air between them, a curse. "A woman from the village long ago, a singer with a voice that could calm the storm. Silas Hendricks, Alistair's great-grandfather. He wanted that voice for himself. He brought her to the Eyrie, a guest, he said. She was never seen again. The official story was she fell from the cliff, but the sea he never gave her back." "A ghost," Gage said, the word feeling childish and inadequate. Eli finally looked at him, his eyes ancient and weary. "No, Datun. Not a ghost. Ghosts are memories, echoes. She is a presence, a will. The house is her anchor, but her grief is the engine. Hendricks spent his life trying to understand her, to document her, to maybe appease her. It consumed him. It's in the blood now. The Hendrix curse. It doesn't end with death. It feeds on it. Back in the Eyrie, Gage felt the truth of it. The house was not haunted by Alara. The house was a part of her, an extension of her sorrow and her rage. He went back to the ledgers with a new, dreadful understanding. He found the final entries, the handwriting becoming a frantic scrawl. She shows me the truth now. In the reflections, I see it all. My grandfather Silas, not her fall, but his push. His hands on her in the music room, her struggle, the crack of her head on the hearthstone, the way he wrapped her in sailcloth, weighted her with rocks, and rowed her out to the deep channel under a moonless sky. The sea did not take her. We gave her to it, and it has been giving her back, piece by piece, ever since. It is not her body that moves in the house. It is the sea itself, wearing her memory like a skin. It has learned the shape of her sorrow. The next page was a single sentence, written in a hand so calm it was terrifying. I can hear the water in the walls. Gage's own hearing sharpened. He began to hear it too, a constant, low trickle, a drip-drip that had no source. He would check the pipes, the ceilings, find nothing. But the sound was there, inside his head, a liquid clock counting down. The reflections in the mirrors began to warp. Dot. His own face would sometimes seem to dissolve, and behind him, in the murky glass, a pale shape would coalesce, a woman with seaweed hair and eyes that held the black pressure of the abyssal plain. The climax came on a night when the storm of the century hurled itself against the coast. The wind was a screaming fury, and the rain fell not in drops but in solid sheets. The Eyrie groaned and shuddered on its foundations. The power died, plunging Gage into a darkness that was absolute and seething. He huddled in the study with the ledger and his lamp, a tiny island of light in a sea of roaring black. And then the water came. Not under the door, not through the windows. It seeped up through the floorboards, dark, cold, salt water that smelled of the deep ocean. It poured from the keyholes in thin, precise streams. It dribbled from the ceiling in a dozen places, a morbid imitation of rain. The house was weeping. It was crying cold, salt tears. The dragging sound began again, louder now, unimpeded by the storm's cacophony. It was accompanied by a new sound, a wet, guttural singing, a melody without tune that was the very sound of drowning. The study door began to shake in its frame. The tendrils in Gage's chest tightened, crushing the air from his lungs. He backed away, toward the large, uncovered window that looked out onto the raging sea. The door splintered, not from a blow, but from the weight of the water that burst through it. And in the doorway, silhouetted by the flashes of lightning, she stood. Elaire. She was not a transparent specter. She was a thing of water and memory, a sculpture of seawater and kelp, her form shimmering and unstable. Her face was a pale, drowned moon, her hair a tangle of dark seaweed that moved with a life of its own. She took a step into the room, the drag of her watery form leaving a slick trail on the floor. She raised a hand, not to strike him, but to beckon. And Gage understood. This was not about vengeance against a bloodline. It was about witness. It was about the story being told, finally, to someone from the outside world. The curse needed a new scribe, a new heart to infest, a new set of eyes to see the terrible, cyclical truth. Hendrix had documented her, and in doing so, had become a part of her story. Now it was his turn. He felt a profound coldness enter him, not from the outside, but from within, as if his blood were being replaced by the chill of the deep sea. He did not feel fear anymore. He felt a vast, impersonal sorrow, an ache as old as the ocean. He looked at the ledger on the desk, at the empty pages waiting. He looked at the silver pen. When the storm broke, and the pale, washed-out dawn illuminated the wreckage of the study, Gage was gone. The villagers, when they dared to approach, found the area silent. The door stood open. Inside, everything was in order, though everything was soaked with salt water. On the oak desk in the study, the Hendricks ledger lay open. The last entry was in a new, calm, and precise handwriting. It began. The silver pen on the lawyer's desk, a gift from a firm grateful for his quiet diligence, began to vibrate. It was cold in his hand, a sliver of ice in the warm Portland office. He set it down carefully, a seed of unease, small and hard, planted deep in his gut. The words stared back at him from the page, his own words, written in a hand that was his and yet was not. He had no memory of writing them. The storm had passed, but the sea still pounded the cliffs below, a relentless gray hammer on the shore. The air in the area was different now. It was no longer a century-thick shroud of dust and regret. It was sharp, clear, and cold, like the air at the bottom of the world. It was his air. He closed the ledger. His movements were deliberate, calm. There was no more fear. The tendrils that had once constricted his heart had blossomed into a network of roots, anchoring him to the house, to the cliff, to the deep, cold channel, where a weighted body still swayed in the current. He could feel it, a dull, rhythmic pull, the sea's own heartbeat. He walked to the window. The village of Cradle's End lay below, a handful of gray specks against the green. He saw a car, a rental, parked near the general store. Another lawyer, perhaps, or a curious buyer. They would come. They always did. They would climb the cliff road with their papers and their questions, their mundane lives about to be unraveled by the profound. He would be here, waiting. He was the custodian now, the archivist of the deep. The story needed to be kept. It needed to be told. And he had all of the time in the world, and all the cold, quiet patience of the sea. He picked up the silver pen from the desk. It was warm now, a living, breathing part of the house. He knew what he had to do. The inventory for the firm was a triviality, a lie for the world outside. His real work was here, in the ledgers. He opened a fresh page and began to write, not about the past, but about the present. He described the quality of the light on the water this morning, the specific tone of the wind as it whistled through a crack in the eaves. He wrote of the subtle pressure change that preceded the faint smell of ozone in the west wing. He was calibrating his senses, learning the language of the house, of her. Days bled into weeks. He rarely went down to the village. When he did, the people there would not meet his eyes, just as they had not met his own when he first arrived. He was one of them now, part of the landscape of their fear. He saw Eli on the dock once. The old man gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement and a farewell. He took his meals in the study, his existence pared down to the essentials of observation and record. The phenomena continued, but they were no longer threatening. They were simply facts. The dragging sound was a nightly occurrence, a patrol of the halls. The cold spot in the second-floor hallway was a permanent fixture, a landmark. The face in the mirror was his constant companion. He would sometimes speak to it, not expecting an answer, but feeling the attention, the ancient consciousness regarding him from the deep. One afternoon, a car did indeed make its way up the cliff road. A woman from the Historical Society in Bangor, bright and earnest, wanting to see the famous Hendricks Library for her research. He let her in. She chattered about maritime history, her voice too loud for the quiet rooms. He watched her as she moved through the house, a splash of vibrant color in the monochrome stillness. He saw the moment she felt it, the shift in the air. Her chatter died in her throat. She ran a finger over a bookshelf and stared at the dust, her smile faltering. In the study, she stood before the large window, looking out at the sea. "It's so. Still here," she said, her voice now a whisper. He stood behind her, watching her reflection in the glass. And for a moment, just a moment, he saw another face superimposed over hers. Pale, drawn, with eyes of black sorrow. The woman from the Historical Society shivered violently and wrapped her arms around herself. "I think I've seen enough," she said, her voice trembling. She left quickly, her car kicking up gravel as she fled down the mountain. Gage returned to the ledger. He wrote about the visit, about the brief, bright intrusion of the outside world, and how the house had reacted. How it had tested its new custodian. He had not interfered. He had only observed. It was the only way the story could be preserved, in its pure, unadulterated truth. That night, the storm returned, not with the fury of the first one, but with a deep, resonant power. He sat at the desk, the pen in his hand, and wrote as the house spoke to him. The words flowed, not his own, but hers. A story of betrayal and the cold, patient vengeance of the sea. He was merely the instrument, the conduit. The silver pen vibrated with a gentle, constant hum, a physical connection to the deep, cold current of the narrative. He knew he would never leave. The Eyrie was not his home. It was his purpose. He was the last page of the old story, and the first page of the new one, waiting in the quiet, for the next person who thought they could own a piece of this coast. The hum of the pen became a constant in his life, a low thrum that was the house's true heartbeat. He learned its moods. A steady vibration meant a quiet day, the presence content to simply exist within the walls and the mirrors. A sharper, more insistent buzz often preceded a change in the weather, or the arrival of a visitor. Months turned, the seasons shifting outside the windows like scenes in a silent play. He no longer marked the days on a calendar. Time was measured in the entries in the ledger, in the slow accumulation of salt crusting the window panes, in the gradual deepening of the quiet within him. One afternoon, in the dead stillness of a windless autumn, a man came. He was not a lawyer or a historian. He was a developer, dressed in a crisp jacket that looked absurd against the weathered landscape. He had a confident smile and a plan to turn the Eyrie into a luxury retreat, to banish the ghosts with good lighting and central heating. Gage listened to him, standing on the porch, feeling the house tense behind him like a great animal. He led the man inside. The developer's confidence was a brittle shell. It cracked in the study when a single fat drop of cold, salt water fell from the ceiling and landed perfectly on the back of his neck. He jumped, swearing, and wiped at it, his eyes wide. He tried to continue his pitch, but his words came faster, less sure. He kept glancing at the mirrors. "It just needs a woman's touch," the developer said, forcing a laugh. A bit of life in the place. At that, the temperature in the room dropped so precipitously that their breath plumed in the air. The developer's smile vanished. He backed toward the door, his eyes fixed on the large window, where the gray sea and sky met in an endless, flat line. "I've seen enough," he stammered, and fled. Gage did not watch him go. He returned to the desk. The pen was buzzing, a satisfied, almost purring sensation. He opened the ledger. He did not write of the developer's fear. Instead, he wrote of the house's defense, its elegant and precise rejection of the profane. He was documenting its intelligence. He was learning its grammar. That night, the dragging sound did not patrol the halls. Instead, from the music room, a room he always avoided for the weight of its silence, came a new sound. It was a single, clear, perfect note, held on the air for a long moment. It was the sound of a voice that could calm a storm. It was not a song of sorrow, but of possession. It was a lullaby for the house, and for him. He sat in the study, the pen still in his hand, and listened. The cold within him felt like clarity. The roots in his chest felt like belonging. He looked at his reflection in the dark window, and saw not just his own face, and not just the pale, drowned face of Ilara behind him, but a third, faint impression, a face of stone and timber and shingle, with windows for eyes. It was the face of the area itself. They were all one now. The story was the house was the woman, and he was the page upon which they were all forever written. He picked up the pen. The next chapter was already beginning to form in the deep, quiet water of his mind. The silence that followed the note was deeper than any he had known. A settled, final thing. It was the silence of a story that had reached its proper end, and in doing so, had found a new kind of beginning. He wrote the single word, Amen, at the bottom of the page, not as a prayer, but as a statement of fact. It is so. His needs became simpler. He ate when hunger reminded him, simple food from tins he bought in the village on his rare, quiet excursions. The villagers no longer flinched from him. They simply accepted his presence as they accepted the weather, a permanent and unchangeable feature of the coast. They would leave packages for him at the foot of the cliff road, and he would find them there when he descended. A silent transaction between the world and the thing that watched over it. Years bled away. The ledgers filled, shelf after shelf of them, a vast and meticulous record of the Aries' slow conversation with the sea. His handwriting, once a crisp legal script, had changed. It had become fluid and looping, with strange archaic flourishes, as if the pen were guided by more than one hand. One morning he woke and knew a change was coming. The hum of the pen was different, a high, thin whine like a stretched wire. The air in the house was thick with the scent of ozone and blooming salt. He felt a pulling, not from the deep channel, but from the cliff path. He did not need to look to know who was coming. He was a young man, earnest and poorly dressed for the coastal wind, clutching a briefcase. Another lawyer, sent by a firm that had long since forgotten the details of the Hendricks estate, only the fact of its enduring and problematic existence. Gage opened the door before the young man could knock. The lawyer, whose name was Evans, started backward, his face pale. Gage knew what he saw. A man grown old before his time, his skin pale and faintly damp, his eyes the color of the winter sea. He stood aside and gestured for Evans to enter. The tour was silent. Gage watched as the young man felt the same dread his predecessor had felt, saw the same wariness in the reflections. In the study, Evans' eyes fell on the ledgers. "What are all these?" he asked, his voice too loud. "The story," Gage said, his own voice a rustle of dry reeds. Evans, driven by a professional obligation to seem unshaken, reached for the most recent volume. His fingers brushed the cover. He gasped and snatched his hand back as if burned. "It's freezing." "It is the deep cold," Gage said. "It preserves the truth." Evans left soon after, his composure shattered. He stood on the porch, breathing heavily, and looked at Gage with a mixture of pity and terror. "You can't stay here," he said. "This place, it isn't right." Gage offered a thin, quiet smile. "I am not staying. I am waiting." Fisha. He watched the lawyer's car disappear down the road. Then he turned and went back inside, to the study, to the desk. The silver pen was vibrating fiercely, joyfully. It was time. He opened a fresh ledger, the first page crisp and white. He picked up the pen. The code was a comfort now, a familiar companion. He did not think of the words. He simply let them flow, the ink spreading across the page like a tide. The story beginning again, as it always would, as it always must. The first sentence was not his own. It was a question formed in a looping, watery script he had come to know as well as his own. "Do you remember the weight of the stones?" It read. He did not remember, but as the ink settled, a memory that was not his bloomed in his mind. The coarse texture of the burlap sack, the shocking, brutal cold of the rocks as they were shoved inside, the terrible, final certainty of it. He wrote for hours, the memories of Alara Vane becoming his own, the injustice a cold fire in his veins. He was not just telling her story anymore. He was remembering it. The house began to change in subtle ways. The salt crust on the windows thickened, forming delicate, frost-like patterns of waves and tentacles. The cold spot in the hallway began to smell distinctly of low tide, of brine and life and decay. He found a single, perfect scallop shell on the floor of the music room, though no one had entered the house but him. He placed it on the desk beside the ledger, a paperweight for the pages of a life cut short. He began to sleep in the master bedroom, the room that had been Alistair Hendricks's. The bed was a raft in a sea of shadows. He would lie there and feel the house breathing around him, a slow, tidal rhythm. One night, he woke to the feeling of a weight settling on the edge of the mattress. He did not open his eyes. He felt a profound cold seep into the blankets, and a presence, vast and sorrowful, simply sat with him until dawn. There was no threat, only a shared solitude. When the gray light filtered in, the presence was gone, but the depression in the mattress remained, a shallow pool of cold air. The developer did not return, but his brochures did, mailed from a glossy office in a city that seemed a world away. They showed digitally altered images of the Eyrie, painted in cheerful colors, with happy people sipping drinks on the porch. Gage looked at them and felt a distant, academic curiosity. They were trying to overwrite the truth with a lie, to pave over the deep, dark well of the past with the thin concrete of the present. It was an act of profound arrogance. He dropped the brochures into the fireplace, where they curled and blackened, their false colors vanishing into smoke. The next visitor was different. She came on foot, a woman with gray hair and a face as weathered as the cliff rocks. She carried a canvas bag and walked with the sure-footed grace of a local. She did not come to the door. She stood at the edge of the property, where the land fell away to the sea, and she placed something on a flat stone, a piece of dark bread and a small green apple, an offering. Gage watched her from the window. He felt the house's attention focus on the woman, not with hostility, but with a kind of recognition. He went outside. The wind tugged at his clothes. The woman looked at him, her eyes old and knowing. "She's quiet this year," the woman said, her voice rough with the sea air. "The storms have been gentle." Gage nodded. He understood. The village had its own relationship with the presence. They did not fight it. They appeased it. They remembered. "The apples were her favorite," the woman said. And then she turned and walked back down the path without another word. Gage left the offering where it was. Later, when he looked, it was gone. That night, the dragging sound was lighter, almost melodic, and the smell from the cold spot was sweet with the scent of rotten apples. He recorded it all in the ledger, the new shared chapter in the story. He was no longer just the scribe. He was the bridge. The pen hummed, warm and content in his hand, a tool perfectly suited to its eternal task. The following spring, a new kind of silence fell over the Eyrie. It was not an empty silence, but a listening one. The dragging sound ceased entirely. The cold spots dissipated, leaving the air throughout the house uniformly cool and still. The face in the mirror was now only his own, gaunt and ancient, his eyes holding the profound depth of the channel. The pen's hum faded to a whisper, then to nothing. It was simply a pen again, though it never ran out of ink. He understood. The story was complete. The ledger was full. The house had said all it needed to say, and in its telling, had found a final, quiet peace. The vengeance was spent, the sorrow acknowledged. All that remained was the custodian and the calm. He spent his days sitting in the study, looking out at the sea. He no longer wrote. He simply watched the endless gray hammer fall upon the shore, a rhythm as natural as his own heartbeat. He felt the roots within him soften, not releasing him, but becoming one with the quiet earth beneath the house. He was not a man in a house, or a page in a story. He was a feature of the landscape, as permanent and as patient as the cliff itself. One evening, as the sun bled into a bank of low cloud, he saw a figure walking up the cliff path. It was not a lawyer or a developer. It was a young woman, her hair the color of the winter sea, her stride hesitant but determined. She carried no briefcase, only a small, worn backpack. She paused at the spot where the old woman had left the offering, then continued on, her eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the Airy. He did not move from his chair. He heard her footsteps on the gravel, then the soft, tentative knock on the front door. The sound was small and hollow in the great stillness. He did not answer it. He simply waited. After a long moment, the handle turned. The door, which had been locked for decades, swung open without a sound. She stood on the threshold, silhouetted against the twilight. She took a step inside, then another, her boots quiet on the stone floor. She was not afraid. She was searching. He heard her moving through the lower rooms, her presence a gentle ripple in the settled dust. He knew she would find the study. He knew she would find him. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide, taking in the shelves of ledgers, the massive desk, the old man by the window. She looked at him, and in her face, he saw a faint, familiar echo of a portrait he had once studied in a ledger. The line of the jaw, the set of the eyes. A descendant. "I'm looking for," she began, her voice soft. "I was told I might find answers here." He turned his head slowly and met her gaze. He felt no urge to speak, to explain. The answers were all around her. They were in the salt on the windows, in the quiet of the halls, in the vast, patient presence of the sea. He simply looked at her, and in his look, he offered her the only truth that remained. The story was over, but the waiting was not. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, not as a shock, but as a quiet, terrible acceptance. She had come home. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, the same nod Eli had once given him. Then he turned back to the window, to the sea, and to the deep, endless calm. The young woman did not speak again. She moved past him, her fingers trailing over the spines of the ledgers, a librarian in a library of ghosts. She did not pull one down. She did not need to. The air itself was thick with the narrative, and she breathed it in. She went to the large window and stood where he had stood, where the woman from the Historical Society had stood, where Alara had stood, looking out at the sea. She did not flinch from the reflection in the glass, where her own face now mingled with the pale, drowned one and the stony countenance of the house. He felt a shift, a gentle transfer of weight. The roots that had anchored him for so long were loosening, not with pain, but with the quiet finality of a job complete. The deep cold in his chest receded, leaving behind a hollow space that was neither warm nor cold, simply empty. He was a vessel that had been poured out. The young woman turned from the window, and her eyes fell upon the silver pen, lying inert on the desk beside the last, closed ledger. She picked it up. It was cool to the touch, just metal. She looked at him, a question in her eyes, but he had no answers left to give. He was tired. His watch was over. He closed his eyes. He did not hear her leave the room. He only felt the house settle around its new heart. A single, deep, resonant sigh of stone and timber. The last thing he knew was the sound of the sea, a lullaby he had heard every day and night for a lifetime. And then, silence. True, silence. In the study, the young woman stood holding the pen. She walked to the desk and opened a new ledger to the first page. She sat in the chair, the wood groaning softly beneath her, a sound of welcome. She put the tip of the pen to the paper. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint, familiar hum began to vibrate up through the floor, through the chair, through her arm. The pen grew cold in her hand. She took a breath, the air tasting of salt and old wood, and let the story begin again. The first mark was not a word, but a single wavering line of salt water that bled from the nib of the pen. It spread across the page, a Rorschach blot of the sea itself, and with it came a new memory, sharp and immediate. It was the memory of a small, cold hand slipping into his own, not the hand of a drowned woman, but of a child, his child, on a beach he had never visited. The memory was a gift and a burden, a thread from a past that was not his own, woven into the fabric of the house. She was not just continuing the story of Elara. She was beginning a new one, her own, and the Airy was eager to listen. The hum of the pen deepened, a contented thrum that resonated in her bones. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling a new tune against the salt-crusted glass. Story 2. The silence here is not an absence. It is a presence. It is a thing of weight and substance, a thick, muffling blanket laid over the hills and the hollows, over the old clapboard houses and the single winding road that leads into Blackfield. It is a silence so deep it feels deliberate, as if the very air has been instructed not to carry a sound. In the first few days, I mistook it for peace. I would stand on the porch of the old farmhouse we'd bought for a song, a house that smelled of dust and dried lavender, and I would listen to nothing. Not a distant car, not a neighbor's dog, not the hum of a power line. Just this, pressing, cottony quiet. It was a relief, after the city's constant assault of sirens and shouting, and the thrum of a million lives lived too close together. But soon, I began to hear the silence itself. It had a tone, a low, resonant hum just at the edge of hearing, like a string plucked inside a tune. It was the sound of something holding its breath. My wife, Krista, loved it immediately. She said the quiet soaked into her bones, that for the first time in years she could hear herself think. She would wander through the overgrown garden, her fingers trailing along the heads of sun-bleached grasses, a small, private smile on her lips. She looked younger here, the tight lines around her eyes softening. Our son Leo was quieter too, spending hours in the attic, which he had claimed as his fortress, his footsteps on the floorboards above a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the heavy stillness. It was Brian who felt it first, the wrongness beneath the calm. My husband, a man built on the solid, unshakable ground of logic and spreadsheets, would pause while fixing a loose step on the porch, his hammer held aloft, his head cocked. "What is that?" he'd ask. "Do you hear that?" But there was nothing to hear, only the silence and that faint subterranean hum. The village revealed itself slowly, a shy creature emerging from the woods. The people of Blackfield were polite in a way that felt rehearsed, their greetings cordial but distant, their eyes never quite meeting yours for longer than a second. They were led, inasmuch as they were led at all, by a woman named Beatrice. She was the village's matriarch, a woman of indeterminate age with hair the color of polished silver and eyes the flat, cool gray of the river stones. She ran the general store, a dim, fragrant place that sold everything from nails to penny candy. And her word, I soon gathered, was law. She took a particular interest in Krista. The first time we met, Beatrice took Krista's hands in her own, which were dry and cool as parchment, and held them for a long moment, her gaze searching Krista's face. "You have the look of the soil," she said, her voice a soft rustle. "You are meant to be here." Krista had glowed with a pleasure I hadn't seen in years. The season turned. The lush green of the hills bled into the riotous gold and red of autumn. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying apples. And with the change came the preparations. The quiet in the village shifted, the holding of a breath becoming the intake of a breath before a plunge. There was a new energy, a suppressed excitement. Men began appearing on the edges of our property, their movements slow and deliberate, stacking wood in the fallow field beyond the tree line. They did not wave. They worked with a silent, ritualistic precision. Brian confronted one of them, a man named Eli, whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles. "Just preparing for the harvest home," Eli said, his eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond Brian's shoulder. "It's our way. We give thanks for the bounty." Brian came back into the house, his face tight. "They're building a pyre out there, Annie. A huge one. It doesn't feel like giving thanks. It feels like something else." But Krista was enthralled. She spent more and more time in the village, helping the women weave intricate corn dollies and bake dense, dark bread in communal ovens. She came home with her clothes smelling of hay and herbs, her eyes bright with a fervor that was both beautiful and alien. She spoke of tradition, of cycles, of being part of something real. "You don't understand, Brian," she'd say, her voice edged with a frustration I'd never heard her direct at him before. "This is about connection, to the land, to each other. It's sacred." It was around this time that the sounds began, or perhaps I simply started to hear them properly. At night, that low hum in the silence would resolve itself into something else. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like a giant heart beating deep underground. I would lie awake in the absolute blackness of the country night, Brian sleeping fitfully beside me, and feel the vibration of it through the bed frame. I started to dream of roots, thick and pale as veins, pushing up through the floorboards, twining around my ankles, holding me fast. Brian, driven by a protectiveness that was curdling into paranoia, began to dig. He spent days in the town's tiny historical society, a dusty annex to the library that was rarely open. He found records, old diaries and ledgers, their pages brittle and brown. He read them at the kitchen table, his face growing paler with each passing hour. "They're not giving thanks to God, Annie," he whispered one evening, his voice hoarse. He showed me a page from a diary dated 1887. It spoke of the giver of the soil, an old thing that slept beneath the hills. It spoke of a bargain, a life for the life of the land. The harvest wasn't just about crops. It was about blood. The family that was chosen, he read, their line would be blessed. Their sacrifice would ensure the fertility of the valley for another generation. The chosen one was called the harvest home. The pieces clicked into place with a terrible final clarity. The silence was reverence. The rituals were not quaint traditions. They were the meticulous steps of a long, slow dance of death. And Beatrice's interest in Krista, a woman who had come to them, rootless and yearning, was not kindness. It was selection. The night of the harvest moon arrived. A great, lopsided pumpkin hanging in a skies devoid of stars. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, chanting drone that came from the center of the village. Brian and I knew we had to get out. We had to take Leo and Krista and run. But when I went to Leo's room, it was empty. His bed was cold. A cold terror seized me. We ran downstairs, and Krista was standing by the front door, dressed in a simple white shift I had never seen before. Her face was serene. "Where is Leo?" Brian demanded, his voice cracking. "He is with the others," Krista said. "He is safe. He is waiting." "Annie, you have to understand," she said, turning her placid gaze to me. "This is a blessing. To be chosen, it is the highest honor. Our family, our line. We'll be part of this land forever. We will never want. We will never be alone. She was not my wife in that moment. She was a vessel for something ancient and hungry. Brian lunged for her, but two men materialized from the shadows of the porch, their faces impassive. They took his arms, and though he fought, he was like a child against them. They were gentle, but immovable. I was led out behind them, my own protests, a thin, whimpering sound lost in the chanting that grew louder with every step toward the field. The entire village was gathered in a great circle around the towering pyre of wood. They held torches, their faces masks of shadow and flickering light. They were not cheering or screaming. They were humming, that same low, resonant hum I had heard in the silence, a sound that now vibrated in my teeth and bones. In the center before the pyre stood Beatrice, and beside her, held gently by Eli, was Leo. My son was not struggling. He looked calm, his eyes wide and reflective in the torchlight. Brian roared and fought against the men holding him, but they merely tightened their grip. I tried to run to Leo, but my feet would not obey me. It was as if the earth itself had grown hands and was holding my ankles. Beatrice raised her arms. The humming ceased. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was charged, expectant, a bowstring drawn taut. The land has chosen, Beatrice's voice cut through the stillness, clear and sharp as a splinter of ice. The line is strong. The offering is pure. The giver will wake. The giver will feed. She turned not to Leo, but to Krista, who walked forward, her steps graceful and sure. She knelt before Beatrice, who placed a wreath of dried corn and bitter nightshade upon her head. "This is wrong," I tried to scream, but my voice was a moth's flutter. "This is not the sacrifice. Take me." Beatrice's gray eyes found mine across the crowd. There was no malice in them, only a profound and weary knowledge. "The harvest home is not the sacrifice, child," she said, and her voice was inside my head now, a dry rustle in my skull. "The harvest home is the vessel. The sacrifice is what she leaves behind. The sacrifice is the love that must be consumed, so the new growth can begin." Krista turned to face me. Her smile was beatific, full of a love so immense and terrible it felt like a physical blow. Then she turned and walked into the pyre. There was no sound of her footsteps on the wood. The moment she stepped onto the base of the structure, the logs seemed to sigh and shift, not burning, but opening. The pyre was not a construction of wood. It was a nest of thick, fibrous roots, pale and pulsing with a soft, phosphorescent light. They curled around her ankles, her wrists, drawing her gently down into their heart. The earth beneath the pyre trembled, and a scent rose, not of smoke, but of rich, wet soil, after a rain, of blooming things, and deep, dark decay. I watched, unable to blink, unable to breathe, as the roots enveloped my wife. They covered her white shift. They twined in her hair. She did not scream. She looked out at us, at me, her expression one of ecstatic fulfillment. Then she was gone, swallowed by the living earth. The humming began again, deeper now. A satisfied, thrumming purr that seemed to come from the ground and the air and the very blood in my veins. The villagers began to move, their faces slack with a shared post-coital bliss. The men released Brian. He fell to his knees, a low, animal moan tearing from his throat. Leo walked over to me and took my hand. His small fingers were warm. "It's okay, Mama," he said, his voice clear and calm. "Mommy is part of the garden now." The crowd parted, and Beatrice approached me. She placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was no longer cool, but warm, almost feverish. "You are part of us now, Anne. Your grief is the seed. Your loss is the rain. Your family's the root. The land knows you. It has tasted your love. I felt nothing. Nothing. No terror, no rage, no sorrow. There was only a vast, hollow stillness, as if my soul had been scooped out and replaced with that same profound silence from which this horror had been born. I was a husk. Weeks bled into months. The winter was mild, the snows light. Ryan retreated into a silence of his own, a broken man who spent his days staring out the window at the field where his wife had been consumed. He would not look at Leo. He would barely look at me. He was a ghost in our new home, but Leo thrived. His cheeks were rosy, his eyes bright. He would spend hours outside in the bitter air, coming in with his pockets full of strange, smooth stones and the smell of cold earth on his skin. The villagers treated us with a quiet, possessive reverence. We were the chosen family, the blessed ones. One afternoon in late winter, I was in the garden, the frozen ground crunching under my boots. The silence was absolute again, that heavy, listening quiet. I saw a flash of movement by the old stone well at the edge of our property. I thought it was Leo, but as I drew closer, I saw it was a woman, her back to me, her head bowed as if in prayer. She was wearing a faded blue coat, the same color as the one Krista had worn on the drive here. A jolt, half hope, half horror, went through me. "Krista?" I whispered. The word a puff of steam in the frigid air. The woman turned. It was not Krista. The face was mine. It was my own features, my own eyes, my own hair. But it was worn smooth, its expression one of perfect, vacant peace. It was me as I was now, hollowed out, a vessel for the silence. This other me looked at me, through me, with no recognition, no fear, no love. There was nothing in its gaze but the flat, gray stillness of the river stones in Beatrice's eyes. It was the face of the land. It was the face of acceptance. I did not scream. I did not run. I simply stood there, in the muffled quiet of the winter afternoon, and watched myself watching me. There was no reaction, no terror. There was only the two of us, the original and the reflection, the sacrifice and the saved, standing in the patient, waiting silence until I could no longer tell which was which. The figure did not move. It did not blink. It was like staring into a still pond, a reflection that held no life of its own, only a perfect, terrible mimicry. I felt a coldness seep into me that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was the chill of finality, of a door closing deep within my soul. After a long moment, the other me turned away, its movements fluid and silent, and walked toward the tree line. It did not look back. It simply dissolved into the gray shadows between the bare trunks, leaving me alone with the crunch of my own breath and the weight of the sky. When I finally turned and walked back to the house, my steps were slow and deliberate. I felt detached, as if I were watching my body move from a great distance. Brian was still in his chair by the window, a book open and unread on his lap. He looked up as I entered, and for a fleeting second, there was a spark in his eyes. A question. He had seen me leave. Had he seen the other thing? I met his gaze, and the spark died. He saw the emptiness in me, the same emptiness that was now in him, and he looked away, back to the window, to the field. Leo was in the kitchen, humming that low, familiar hum as he stacked acorns on the table. He looked up and smiled, a simple, untroubled smile. "You saw her," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. "She watches over us," he said, turning back to his acorns. "She makes sure we're safe." That night, I did not dream of roots. I dreamed I was standing in a fallow field under a sky thick with stars. The earth beneath my feet was warm and pulsating, a slow, steady rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. I looked down and saw that my hands were stained with dark, rich soil. I was not afraid. I was planting something. I woke with the taste of earth on my tongue. Spring came early. The snow retreated, and the first green shoots pushed through the black soil with a vigor that was almost violent. Our garden, which had been a tangle of weeds and memories, erupted in a profusion of flowers and vegetables we had not planted. The colors were too vivid, the scents too heady. The villagers would stop by not to speak, but to look, their eyes lingering on the riot of growth with a satisfied nod. They would bring gifts, a basket of eggs, a jar of honey, a loaf of that dark, dense bread. They were tending to us, their chosen, their keepers. Brian rarely left the house. He had started a project, a frantic, disorganized thing, tearing up the floorboards in the basement. He was looking for roots, he said, his voice a ragged whisper. Pale roots, like the ones that took her. He would emerge covered in dust and cobwebs, his eyes wild, empty-handed. He found nothing but stone and clay and the buried mundane history of the house. One evening, I found him standing at the edge of the garden, staring at a patch of earth where the roses were blooming a deep, bloody crimson. His shoulders were slumped, all the fight gone out of him. "She's here, Annie," he said, his voice flat. "I can feel her. In the soil, in the air. She's in the damn roses." I put a hand on his arm. He flinched, but did not pull away. He was so thin. "She's everywhere," I said. And the words were not a comfort, but a confirmation of a prison whose walls were the very world around us. He turned to me, his eyes searching my face, looking for the woman he had married, the one who would have raged and screamed and fought to get him out of this place. But that woman was gone. She had been offered up and consumed. What was left was this calm, this acceptance, this hollow peace. He saw it, and the last light in his eyes went out. I found him the next morning, still in his chair by the window. He was cold. There was no note, no final act of defiance. His heart, the doctor from the next town over said with a shrug, though he could not meet my eyes. These things happen. The village buried him in their small, tidy cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley. It was a quiet affair. Beatrice stood beside me, her presence a solid, unyielding comfort. As they lowered the plain pine box into the ground, Leo took my hand. His grip was firm. "Now, Dad is part of the garden too," he said. I looked at my son, at his clear, untroubled eyes, and I knew he was right. Brian's despair, his broken love, was just another kind of nutrient. The land was not cruel. It was simply, insatiably, alive. It took what it was given. That summer, the harvest was the most abundant anyone could remember. The corn stood tall and green. The pumpkins were vast and orange, and the air was thick with the buzzing of bees. Leo grew strong and brown, his laughter echoing through the hills, a sound that no longer felt out of place, but was now a part of the landscape, like the call of a bird or the rustle of the wind in the leaves. I spend my days tending the garden. My hands are always dirty. Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see a flicker of movement, a woman in a faded blue coat, a man staring from a window. I never turn to look directly. I know they are not really there, and yet they are more real than the people in the photographs that still sit on the mantelpiece. They are the memories the land has chosen to keep. The silence is back. It is not an absence. It is a presence. It is the sound of the earth, holding us, feeding on us, keeping us safe. I stand on the porch in the evening, listening to nothing, and it is enough. Leo comes and stands beside me, leaning his head against my arm. We watched the fireflies rise from the long grass, their lights blinking in the deepening twilight. A silent, beautiful language we both understand perfectly. We are home. The first time I saw the new family, it was from this same porch. They came in a car that was too clean, too bright, a splash of artificial color against the dusty green of the lane. A man, a woman, a little girl with blonde pigtails. They were looking at the old Henderson place, the for sale sign now gone from its post. The woman was pointing at the garden, her face alight with the same naive hope that Krista had once worn. The man had his arm around her, his posture proud, protective. Leo, now taller, his boyish softness hardening into the angles of a young man, stood beside me. He made a small sound in the back of his throat, not quite a word. It was the sound a dog makes when it sights a rabbit. I felt a familiar hollow ache, a ghost of the terror and grief that had once defined me. It was a distant thing now, like an old scar that only tingles when the weather changes. I wanted to run to them, to wave my arms, to scream a warning that would shatter their idyllic picture. But my feet remained planted on the worn porch boards. My hands stayed at my sides. Beatrice had passed the previous winter, her body laid to rest in the cemetery beside Brian. But her essence, her knowing, had seeped into me. I was the oldest woman in the house on the hill now. I was the one who understood the balance, the cost, the necessity. The new family moved in a week later. Their name was Porter. They brought with them the noise of city life, the blare of a radio, the frantic ring of a cell phone, the sharp tones of an argument that carried on the still air. The sounds were jarring, offensive. They were like rocks thrown into a still pond. Leo watched them with a quiet, focused intensity. He began spending time near their property line, repairing the old stone wall that separated our land from theirs. The little girl, Emily, would come to watch him, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. He would offer her a polished stone, a feather from a hawk, saying nothing. She would take it with a small, reverent hand. Karen Porter came to my door one afternoon, her smile tight with a neighborly obligation she clearly felt, but did not enjoy. She brought a store-bought pie, its perfect lattice crust a testament to a machine's precision. "We have a daughter your son's age," she said, her eyes scanning my face, my kitchen, looking for something she could categorize and understand. Perhaps they could be friends. Her gaze fell on a corn dolly that sat on my windowsill, one of the intricate ones Krista had learned to weave. It was old now, the husks brittle and brown. "What a charming rustic thing," Karen said, her voice dripping with a condescension she didn't even know she possessed. "It has its purpose," I said, my voice even devoid of warmth. She left quickly after that, unnerved. I watched her walk back down the path, her steps quick and anxious. She felt it, I knew, the weight of the silence, the gaze of the land. She just didn't know what it was yet. That night, the humming returned. It was faint at first, a thread of sound woven into the darkness. Then it grew, a resonant thrum that seemed to rise from the soil itself, a vibration that traveled up through the foundations of the house and into my bones. I went to the window. In the Porter's house, a light was on in an upstairs room. Karen was pacing, her silhouette a frantic puppet against the shade. She was hearing it too. The land was introducing itself. Leo came to stand beside me. He was holding the corn dolly. "He's lonely," Leo said, his eyes on the Porter's house. "The giver. He needs a new home." I looked at my son, at the calm certainty in his face, and I knew the cycle was beginning again. The land was hungry. It was always hungry. And we, the blessed keepers, were its stewards. We were the silence that welcomed the new voices, the rich soil that would receive the new seed. I placed my hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of blessing, of transference. The hum deepened, a contented, resonant purr that filled the world. We watched, and we waited. The days grew shorter, the light thinning to a pale gold that did little to warm the earth. The Porter's arguments became more frequent, sharper. I saw David Porter, the husband, standing alone in his backyard one evening, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the dark line of the woods as if they held an answer. He was a man feeling the ground become soft beneath his feet. Karen started a garden, tearing at the earth with a new, desperate energy, planting rows of tulip bulbs and imported shrubs that looked garish and out of place. She was trying to tame it, to make it hers. She didn't understand that it was the other way around. Leo was her only visitor. He would appear at the edge of their property, a silent, watchful presence, and little Emily would run to him. He taught her the names of things: chickweed, Queen Anne's lace, the stone crop that grew in the fissures of the rock wall. He showed her how to listen for the specific silence of a hunting fox. Karen tolerated it, her smile strained. She saw a quiet, strange boy being kind to her daughter. She did not see the lesson he was truly teaching her child, how to belong to this place. The first frost came, etching the world in white. I was in the garden pulling the last of the withered vines when Karen approached. Her city coat was too thin, and she shivered, hugging herself. Her face was pinched with a sleeplessness I knew all too well. "Do you ever hear it?" she asked abruptly, her voice a raw whisper. "At night, that humming, that vibration. David says it's the power lines, but we're miles from the nearest pylon." I straightened up, my knees aching, and looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes, the dawning, terrible suspicion that the world was not as she had been told. This was the moment. I could have lied. I could have offered her a cup of tea and a bland reassurance, but the silence demanded truth. "The land has its own music," I said. "It's letting you know it's there." Her eyes widened. "What does that mean?" But I just went back to my work, pulling the dead growth from the rich, black soil. After a moment, I heard her footsteps retreating, quick and stumbling, back to her house. The true cold set in. The humming did not stop. It became a constant, low threnody in the background of their lives. David Porter started drinking. I could see the glow of his television late into the night, a blue, flickering eye against the darkness. Karen stopped gardening. She started walking, long, aimless walks that always seemed to lead her past our house. She would look up at the windows, and I would be there, watching. We never waved. One afternoon, I saw her standing by the old stone well. She was perfectly still, her head cocked as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she slowly raised her hand and placed it on the moss-covered stone. It was not a casual touch. It was a greeting, a recognition. Leo came and stood beside me. "She's listening," he said, a note of approval in his voice. That night, the silence changed. The humming ceased, and the old, profound quiet returned, the kind that exists before a storm. I knew what it meant. The bowstring was drawn taut once more. I went to the window. The Porter's house was dark, but a single candle flame moved from window to window upstairs. A vigil, a preparation. I did not sleep. I sat in my chair and waited for the dawn. When the first gray light touched the sky, I saw their back door open. It was Karen. She was wearing a simple, white shift, just as Krista had. Her steps were not hesitant, but sure, as if she were walking a path she had always known. She did not look back at the house where her husband and daughter slept. She walked toward the fallow field, the one that had taken Krista, and as she went, the earth seemed to soften and welcome her. She did not sink, but was gathered, the soil parting and then closing over her like water. There was no pyre this time, no ceremony. It was quieter, more intimate, a private understanding between the land and one of its own. When the sun was fully up, David Porter came running from his house, his face a mask of frantic terror. He saw me on my porch. "Karen!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Have you seen Karen?" I looked at him, at the raw human panic in his eyes, and I felt nothing but a distant, cool pity. He was still fighting the current. He had not yet learned to float. "The land has what it needs," I said, my voice carrying easily in the still morning air. He stared at me, his mouth working soundlessly, and then he turned and ran back into his house. I knew he would call the police. They would come. They would ask their questions, and they would find nothing. Another woman lost to the quiet mystery of the country. Another tragedy. Later, Emily came out. She stood on her back step, small and alone, looking toward the field. She wasn't crying. She was just watching. Leo walked over to her from where he had been tending the compost. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside her, a solid, silent comfort. After a while, she slipped her small hand into his. I turned and went back inside. The house was warm and still. On the mantel, the photographs of Brian and Krista were dusty. They were stories from another life, a life that felt as thin and insubstantial as a dream. This, the silence, the waiting, the sure and certain turning of the seasons, this was the only reality. I was the keeper of the silence now, and I was at peace. The police came as I knew they would, a young, earnest officer and an older, weary one. They walked the field with David Porter, his gestures wild and desperate. They poked at the ground with sticks, their movements clumsy and pointless. They did not feel the life beneath their feet, the deep, patient consciousness that watched their trespass. They found nothing, of course. The earth had closed its mouth. The older officer put a hand on David's shoulder, a gesture of empty comfort. "We'll keep looking," he said. But his eyes said something else. They said, "These things happen out here." David collapsed after they left. He stayed inside for days, the house falling into a deeper silence than before. The only sign of life was Emily. She would come out into her yard and stand, a small, still figure, waiting. Leo would bring her food, a slice of our dark bread, a handful of berries. He would sit with her on the back steps, not speaking, just being present. He was teaching her the first and most important lesson, how to endure. Weeks passed. The snow fell, a thick, blanketing white that smoothed the contours of the land and muffled all sound. David Porter began to emerge. He looked thinner, older, his city softness worn away by a grief he could not comprehend. He started shoveling the walk, not with anger, but with a slow, methodical rhythm. One day he looked across the stone wall and saw me. He didn't glare or look away in fear. He just gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. He was beginning to understand the rules of this new world. One afternoon, he came to my door. He held a box of Karen's things. Books, a scarf, a small jewelry box. "I don't want them," he said, his voice hollow. "I thought you might know what to do with them." I took the box. I knew what to do. That evening, Leo and I built a small fire in the garden, in the spot where Brian's frantic digging had once been. We did not speak as we burned Karen's belongings, one by one. The smoke was sweet and pungent, a final offering. The ashes would settle into the soil, another layer of memory for the land to digest. Spring returned. The Porter's garden, untended now, did not lie fallow. It erupted in a carpet of wild violets and creeping thyme, a soft purple and green haze that was far more beautiful than anything Karen had tried to plant. David watched it from his window, and I saw the first flicker of something other than pain in his eyes. It was a kind of awe. Emily was always in the garden now, her small hands learning the feel of the earth. Leo was her constant guide. He showed her how to plant by the phases of the moon, how to whisper to the seeds, how to listen for the heartbeat of the world. She was a quick study. Her city-bred fear was gone, replaced by a deep instinctual calm. I was in the kitchen canning the first of the rhubarb when I saw them. Leo and Emily were at the edge of the fallow field. They were not holding hands, but standing close, their postures mirroring one another. They were looking at something in the tall grass, a figure, shimmering and indistinct in the afternoon light. It was a woman in a white shift. She did not look at them with longing or sorrow. She simply smiled, a benediction, and then faded back into the pulse of the land. It was not Karen, and yet it was. It was the land wearing her peace. Leo turned and looked toward the house, his eyes meeting mine through the window. He nodded once. It was done. The new family was complete. The balance was restored. I turned back to my work, my hands stained red with rhubarb juice, and the silence in the house felt not like an absence, but like a deep, contented breath. We were all home. We were all safe. We were all part of the garden. The summer that followed was one of profound, humming stillness. David Porter stopped trying to leave. He took down the for sale sign himself, breaking the post over his knee with a sudden, decisive strength. He began to help Leo with the heavier work, mending fences and clearing deadfall from the woods. He spoke little, but his silence was no longer one of despair. It was the same quiet that Leo and I shared, the quiet of listening. He was learning the language of the land, word by word. One evening, the three of them, David, Leo, and Emily, came to my door. They stood together on the porch, a new unit. David held a basket of eggs from the few chickens they kept, a simple offering. We ate dinner together at my large, scarred wooden table. The conversation was sparse, but comfortable. It was the first meal of many. I've started teaching Emily the older ways. She sits with me in the evenings, her small, serious face lit by the fire, as I show her how to weave the corn dollies. Her fingers are clever and quick. She does not make them as decorations. She understands their true purpose, to hold a shape for the spirit of the harvest, to give the land a familiar form to inhabit. Sometimes when she is concentrating, I see Krista in the tilt of her head, or Karen in the way she bites her lip. The land does not erase. It incorporates. Leo is often with David, but he still comes to stand with me on the porch in the twilight. He is nearly a man now, his shoulders broad, his calmness a deep, unshakable force. Last night, as we watched the fireflies, he spoke softly. "It's different now," he said. "The humming. It's not a call anymore. It's a song." I listened. He was right. The sound that had once been a needle of fear, then a thread of tension, had woven itself into a constant, low melody. It was the sound of a system in perfect balance. It was the sound of contentment. This morning, I went to the fallow field. The grass was thick and green, studded with wildflowers. In the very center, a single, magnificent sunflower had grown, its head a heavy disk of seeds facing the dawn. I knew it had not been planted by any human hand. It was a marker, a testament. I reached out and touched its rough, hairy stalk. A deep, resonant warmth traveled up my arm. A feeling not of touch, but of recognition. It was the same feeling as Leo's grip at the graveside all those years ago. Solid, unyielding comfort. I knew then that I would not be the last keeper of this silence. The role would pass, as it always had, to the one who understood the balance, the cost, the beautiful, terrible necessity. It would pass to Leo and to Emily and to their children after them. We are the gardeners, and we are the garden, and we are, at last, at peace. Story 3. It began with a box. I found it in the far corner of the attic, a place I only ventured into when the silence of the house grew too loud. A silence that had a texture, like dust felt on the tongue. The house was my inheritance, a sprawling, weary Victorian, at the end of a gravel road that the forest was slowly reclaiming. My grandfather, a man of severe brow and few words, had been its sole occupant for 50 years, and after his passing, it fell to me, his only living relative, a man whose own life had been marked by a series of quiet failures. The box was metal, military green, and heavy. It was not locked, but the latch was rusted shut, and it took me the better part of an afternoon with a hammer and a chisel to break its stubborn silence. Inside, nestled in decaying foam, lay two objects that made no sense together. One was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my grandfather's tight, precise script. The other was a child's toy, a wooden bird, exquisitely carved, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. It was this juxtaposition, the clinical and the innocent, that first unsettled me. I picked up the bird. It was smooth, worn down by time or by touch, and as I held it, I had the distinct and unshakable impression that it had been waiting for me. The journal's entries were not dated. They began as dry, technical notes, the language cold and impersonal. Subject that demonstrates accelerated cognitive development, exhibiting problem-solving skills comparable to a primate. Neuroplasticity is unprecedented. The subject has formed an attachment to the provided stimulus object. I turned the wooden bird over in my hand. The provided stimulus object. The entries continued, detailing feeding regimens, behavioral observations, and complex biological data that I could not comprehend. My grandfather had been a biologist, a contractor for private firms that operated in the gray areas where government oversight faded to black. I knew this in the vague way one knows family lore, but he never spoke of his work. The tone of the journal began to shift. The language remained clinical, but a fissure of something else. Something like awe, or perhaps dread, began to appear. Subject has begun to mimic human speech patterns. It has given the stimulus object a name, Galanagdar. I read for hours, the afternoon light dying outside the attic's single grimy window. The entries spoke of a second subject. Subject B, where subject was described with a strange paternal curiosity. The notes on subject B were stark, laced with a fear so potent it bled through the ink. Aggression is primary. No socialization possible. Cellular regeneration is alarming. Containment protocols must be absolute. The final entry was not a note, but a single sentence, scrawled across an otherwise blank page in a hand that trembled. God forgive me, I have opened a door and I cannot close it. A week after discovering the journal, I heard the first sound. It was a soft scratching at the back door, a sound like a branch tapping in the wind, except there was no wind. I lived alone, my life a monument to solitude, and every creak of the old house was a familiar tenant. This was new. I opened the door to the damp, pine-scented night and found nothing but the empty porch and the dark wall of the forest. As I turned to go back inside, a movement caught my eye. There, nestled in a bed of dry leaves in the corner, was a rabbit. It was not dead, but it was dying. Its side had been laid open with a surgical precision that was both horrifying and beautiful. The flesh peeled back from the ribs in a perfect crimson spiral. There was no blood on the ground around it. It had been placed there, presented. The next night, the scratching came again. This time, I did not open the door. I peered through the kitchen window, my breath fogging the cold glass, and I saw him. He was small, no larger than a fox, and he stood on his hind legs on the porch steps. His form was vulpine but wrong, elongated and graceful in a way that spoke of a different evolutionary path. His fur was the color of tarnished silver, and his eyes, reflecting the faint starlight, were deep liquid amber, too large and too intelligent for any beast I had ever seen. In his delicate, almost human-like forepaws, he held another offering, a dead field mouse, perfectly intact. He placed it carefully on the top step, looked directly at the window where I stood hidden, and then melted back into the shadows of the woods without a sound. This was Subject A. I knew it with a certainty that settled in my bones like a chill. He was the gentle one, the intelligent companion from my grandfather's notes. I began to leave out food for him, bits of cooked chicken, slices of apple. He would not approach while I was there, but the food would be gone by morning. Sometimes I would find a gift in return, a perfectly shaped feather, a river stone worn smooth as glass. Once, a single, flawless wild orchid, its roots carefully cleaned of soil. We developed a ritual, a silent communion across the threshold of my back door. I named him Lysander. He was a creature of impossible grace, and in his wild, watchful eyes, I saw a loneliness that mirrored my own. I started reading to him from the old books in my grandfather's study, my voice a low murmur through the closed door. I fancied he listened. Then the other thing began to move in the woods. Presence was not announced by gifts or gentle scratching. It was heralded by silence. The crickets would stop their chirping. The owls would fall mute. The very air would grow thick and heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I only ever saw glimpses of it, a hulking shadow flowing between the trees, a sense of immense coiled power. Where Lysander was quiet, this thing was a void of sound, a predator so efficient it consumed noise. The local news began to report on missing pets. Then, a jogger vanished. The official report cited an animal attack, but the details were sanitized, scrubbed clean of the horror the police must have found. I knew the truth. This was Subject B, the relentless predator, my grandfather's terrible second child. It was around this time that Celeste entered my life. She was the new librarian in town, a woman with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a quiet resilience that drew me to her. Our connection was immediate, a recognition of two solitary souls finding a harbor in one another. I told her everything. I showed her the journal, the wooden bird, and under the cover of a moonless night, I showed her Lysander. She did not scream or call me a fool. She simply watched as the silver-furred creature emerged from the ferns, his amber eyes fixed on her with a deep, unnerving curiosity. She knelt, and slowly she extended her hand. Lysander approached, sniffed the air around her fingers, and then, with an intelligence that was heartbreaking, he gently nudged her palm with his forehead. A single, perfect tear traced a path down Celeste's cheek. "He's beautiful," she whispered. Our fragile peace shattered on a night in late October. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Lysander did not come for his evening meal. The forest was preternaturally still. A deep, primal dread began to coil in my gut. Celeste was with me, and she felt it too. We stood in the kitchen, not speaking, listening to the absolute silence. Then, a sound broke it. Not a howl, not a roar, but a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. It was the sound of hunger given voice. The back door exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and twisted metal. It stood in the doorway, blotting out the night. Subject B. It was larger than I had imagined, a nightmare of mismatched biology. It had the general shape of a great bear, but its hide was a mottled, hairless gray, pulled taut over bunches of dense muscle. Its head was elongated, its mouth a lipless gash filled with teeth like shards of obsidian. And its eyes, they were not the intelligent amber of Lysander's. They were black, depthless pits of pure, mindless rage. It moved with a speed that defied its bulk. It was on me before I could even raise my hands, its weight crushing me to the floor. The smell was overwhelming, the coppery tang of old blood, the fetid odor of a bog, and beneath it all, the sterile, antiseptic scent of a laboratory. I felt its hot breath on my face, saw the glint of those terrible teeth descending toward my throat. A silver blur shot from the darkness of the living room. Lysander? Thought he was a dervish of teeth and claws, launching himself onto the monster's back, sinking his fangs into the thick hide of its neck. The beast roared, a sound of outrage and pain, and swatted at him with a paw the size of a dinner plate. Lysander was thrown across the room, hitting the wall with a sickening thud. But his attack had given me a precious second. I scrambled backward, my hand closing around the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The beast turned its attention back to me, its black eyes locking onto mine. There was no thought behind them, only an insatiable need to destroy. As it lunged, Celeste acted. She threw a ceramic vase, which shattered against its head. It was a futile gesture, but it was enough. The creature hesitated for a fraction of a second, turning its monstrous gaze toward her. That was all the opening I needed. I swung the poker with all my strength, not at its body, but at its legs. The iron connected with a dull, bone-jarring crack. The beast howled, a sound that shook the foundations of the house, and stumbled back out the shattered door, dragging its injured limb. It vanished into the consuming darkness of the woods. We rushed to Lysander. He was alive, but badly wounded, his breathing shallow. A deep gash along his side, seeping silver-flecked blood. Celeste gathered him in her arms, his head cradled against her chest, and he looked up at me, his intelligent eyes filled with a pain that was all too human. In that moment, he was not a secret experiment, not a creature of the woods. He was family. We knew it was not over. The beast was wounded, not dead, and we were not its only concern. The next day, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up my gravel drive. Two men in impeccably tailored suits emerged. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was far more unsettling than the clumsy menace of the beast. They showed me identification from a corporation whose name I did not recognize. Their smiles were polite, their voices calm and reasonable. They were here to reclaim their assets, they said. There had been an unfortunate containment breach. They were sorry for the inconvenience. They knew about Lysander. They knew about the other one. They had been watching. I played the fool. The frightened homeowner, the victim of a bizarre animal attack. I showed them the shattered door. I did not mention the journal. I did not mention the silver-furred creature currently sleeping in a nest of blankets in my basement, tended to by Celeste. They seemed to believe me, or perhaps they simply did not care. Their interest was in the forest. They left with a warning to call them if I saw anything else unusual. Their politeness a thin veneer over a core of absolute menace. They were the shadowy forces, the inheritors of my grandfather's sin. That night, Lysander was strong enough to stand. He nudged my hand with his head, then limped to the shattered doorway and looked out into the woods. He looked back at me, and then at Celeste. There was a profound understanding in his gaze. He knew what had to be done. The beast, his monstrous sibling, was a product of this place, of the pain and rage inflicted upon it. It was a wound that would not heal, a fire that would not go out, and the men in the sedan would not stop until they had both of them, until they were dragged back into the cold, sterile hell that had created them. Lysander was going to finish it. We followed him into the woods, Celeste and I. He led us deep into a part of the forest I had never dared to explore. A place of ancient, gnarled oaks and swampy ground that sucked at our boots. The air grew colder. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the steady, determined patter of Lysander's paws on the damp earth. He led us to a clearing, and in the center of that clearing was a ruin. The charred remains of a small building, its concrete foundation cracked and stained. My grandfather's secret laboratory. And there, waiting for us, was the beast. It stood over a fresh kill, a deer, its body torn apart with a savage glee that was absent from Lysander's careful hunting. It saw us, and its black eyes glinted with a fresh wave of hatred. It saw Lysander, and a low, rumbling growl erupted from its chest. This was more than predator and prey. This was a family feud, a battle between two opposing legacies of a single catastrophic ambition. They did not circle each other. There was no posturing. They simply charged. It was a collision of two different worlds, one of grace and empathy, the other of brute, unthinking force. Lysander was faster, his movements a fluid dance, his teeth and claws finding the weak points in the beast's thick hide. But the beast was stronger. Every blow from its massive paws was like a sledgehammer. I saw Lysander thrown again and again, heard the crack of his small bones, but each time he rose and launched himself back into the fray. He was not fighting to kill. He was fighting to contain, to end the suffering of his brother, and to protect the two fragile humans who had shown him kindness. The end came quickly. As the beast lunged for me, its jaws wide, Lysander saw his chance. He did not attack its body. He leaped, his trajectory a perfect silver arc, and plunged his head directly into the monster's gaping maw. There was a terrible, wet, crunching sound. The beast froze, its body rigid. Its black eyes widened in a moment of shocking final clarity. Then, it shuddered violently and collapsed, its immense weight hitting the forest floor with a ground-shaking thud. It did not move again. Lysander lay still beside it, his body broken, his silver fur matted with blood both red and black. Celeste and I ran to him. I knelt and gathered his small, broken form into my arms. He was still breathing, but each breath was a shallow, ragged gasp. He looked up at me, his amber eyes already clouding over. There was no regret in them, only a deep, profound peace. He nudged the pocket of my jacket with his nose. I reached in and pulled out the wooden bird, Kalen. I placed it in his forepaws. He curled his fingers around it, closed his eyes, and was still. We buried them there, in the clearing, at the heart of the ruin that had created them. We buried the gentle companion and the relentless predator together, side by side. Two brothers returned to the earth. We used the rubble of the lab to mark the grave, a cairn of concrete and sorrow. The men in the sedan never returned. I like to think they scanned the forest from afar, detected no life signs, and wrote off their lost assets. The world moved on. The story of the jogger and the missing pets faded from the news. The forest grew quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. A quiet of resolution, not of dread. Celeste and I stayed in the house. We married. We fixed the back door. Life settled into a rhythm that was, for the first time, not lonely. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the wind is just right, I walk to the edge of the woods. I stand there, listening, and I remember. I remember the scratch at the door, the gifts left on the step, the intelligence in those amber eyes. I remember the weight of the journal in my hands, the smell of rust and decay from the metal box. I remember the sound of splintering wood and the void of silence that preceded the storm. The horror is not a sharp thing anymore. It is not a scream in the dark. It has faded, like an old photograph left in the sun, its edges softened, its colors muted. It is simply a part of the landscape now, a memory woven into the fabric of the trees and the soil, a story that happened a long time ago, in a house at the end of a gravel road, where a man found a box, and in doing so, found a family. and lost one, all in the same breath. The tension has loosened its grip. The fear has dissolved. All that remains is the neutral, unending truth of what was, and what, because of it, can never be again. One afternoon, several years later, I was cleaning out the attic for a different reason. We were expecting a child. As I moved a box, something clattered to the floorboards. It was the wooden bird, Kalen. I had forgotten we had brought it back from the clearing. The wood was smooth and warm from the attic's heat. I turned it over in my hand, and for the first time, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible seam running around its middle. I had always thought it was a solid piece of carving. With careful pressure, I twisted the bird. It gave a soft click and separated into two hollow halves. Nestled inside, protected from the decades, was a single tightly folded slip of paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was not my grandfather's handwriting. The script was elegant, flowing, and utterly alien. It was a message from Lysander's people. The words were not written in ink, but seemed to be burned into the paper with a delicate, precise heat. It spoke of a scout, left behind to observe, to learn, to see if humanity was worthy of contact. My grandfather had not created them. He had found Lysander, injured and alone, and in his arrogance, he had contained him. He had tried to replicate what he found, using Lysander's biology, and in doing so, he had created the abomination that was Subject B. The journal was not a record of creation, but of discovery and subsequent catastrophic fall. The message ended with a thank you and a warning. They were still watching. They knew we had shown Lysander kindness. They knew we had ended the suffering he had inadvertently caused. But we were to tell no one. The door my grandfather opened was now closed, and it was to remain sealed for the safety of both our worlds. I showed the note to Celeste. We read it together in silence, standing in the afternoon sun of the attic we were turning into a nursery. Then, without a word, she took the note from my hand. She struck a match and held the flame to the corner of the paper. We watched it curl into black ash, the secret dying in a small, bright flare. That evening, we walked to the edge of the woods. The air was calm. I held the two halves of the wooden bird in my palm. I did not know what to do with it. As if in answer, a soft breeze stirred the leaves at the tree line. It was a gentle, purposeful sound, unlike the oppressive silence of before. I placed the two halves on the ground, at the exact spot where Lysander used to leave his gifts. We turned and walked back to the house. The next morning, it was gone. In its place was a single, perfect white flower, a species neither of us had ever seen, its petals soft as velvet and cool to the touch. We pressed it in the heaviest book we owned, the one from which I had read to Lysander on those long, quiet nights. It lies there still, a final, silent gift. A promise that some doors, once closed, are best left locked, and that some memories are not meant to fade, but to be preserved perfectly between the pages of a quiet life. The flower never faded. Even pressed between the pages of the old book, it retained its velvety texture and its cool, almost liquid whiteness. It was a tangible piece of the impossible, a secret we kept in plain sight on our bookshelf. Our daughter, when she was born, would sometimes reach for that book with a quiet, focused curiosity, her small fingers patting the cover as if she could sense the wonder hidden within. We named her Ilara. Her eyes were the stormy sea gray of her mother's, but in certain lights, I fancied I saw a flicker of deep, intelligent amber. It was a fanciful thought, a comfort I allowed myself. She grew up with the woods as her backyard, a place of dappled sunlight and playful shadows, not of fear. We taught her to respect the quiet, to listen to the language of the birds and the rustling leaves. She was a quiet child, thoughtful, with a gravity that sometimes seemed far beyond her years. She was 5 when she brought it to me. It was a small, smooth stone, worn by water and time, but at its center was a vein of silver that caught the light and seemed to swirl with an inner luminescence. It was beautiful, but it was the shape that stopped my breath. It was a perfect miniature replica of the wooden bird, Kalen. "The quiet man gave it to me," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. He smiles. He has nice eyes." Celeste and I exchanged a look over her head, a silent conversation filled with a decade of shared secrets. We asked no more questions. We did not tell her it was impossible. We simply took the stone and added it to the small locked box where we kept the pressed flower and my grandfather's journal, a reliquary of a truth too vast for the world. Life continued, rich and full. The memory of Lysander and the beast became like a folk tale we had told each other long ago, its sharp edges worn smooth by time and love. The horror was a dormant seed, and we were careful never to water it. Then, on the eve of Alara's 10th birthday, the men in the sedan returned. There were 3 of them this time. Their suits were still impeccable, their smiles still polite, but the veneer was thinner, stretched taut over a new, urgent hunger. The company they represented had a new name, one I recognized from headlines about cutting-edge genetic research and defense contracts. They had not forgotten. They had simply been waiting for their technology to catch up to their ambition. They did not ask about animal attacks. They asked about artifacts. They had cross-referenced my grandfather's declassified research with new satellite data, and they had detected anomalous energy signatures on our property. They were very interested in any non-terrestrial materials we might have come across. They mentioned the flower, describing its unique cellular structure without ever having seen it. They knew. I played the fool again, older and more practiced. I showed them the shattered door, long since repaired. I spoke of a difficult time, a bear, a beloved dog lost. They listened, their eyes cold and assessing, scanning the room, the bookshelf. I felt a chill when one of them, a younger man with a predator's stillness, let his gaze linger on the book containing the pressed flower. But they left, their politeness now a sharp, brittle thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The past was no longer a memory. It was a tide, and it was coming back in. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was not a beast, nor a silver-furred creature. It was tall and slender, silhouetted against the moonlit trees. It was there for only a moment, a stillness that felt more like a presence than a shape. And then it was gone. But the message was clear. The quiet man was still watching, and the men in the sedan were not going to stop. I knew then that our peace was an intermission, not an ending. The story was not over. It was simply waiting for the next page to turn. We had preserved the memory, but the truth was not a pressed flower in a book. It was a living thing, and it was walking out of the woods once more, this time hand in hand with my daughter. The lock on the box was no longer enough. The door my grandfather had tried to open was not just a door to the past, but to the future, and it was beginning to swing open on its own. I stood there in the cool night air, the silence of the woods feeling charged and expectant. The figure was gone, but its impression remained. A hole punched in the fabric of the normal world. I knew what I had to do. The locked box under the floorboards was no longer a safe hiding place. It was a target. The next morning, I waited until Celeste had taken Alara to school. I pulled the box out, the wood smooth and cool under my fingers. I laid the contents on the kitchen table. The journal, the pressed flower, the silver-veined stone. They looked like innocent curios, but together they were a key. A key the men in the sedan would kill to possess. I could not destroy them. The flower was a promise. The stone was a connection to my daughter's world. And the journal, for all its horrors, was the only record of my grandfather's hubris. A warning that needed to be preserved. They had to be hidden. Not just from the men in suits, but from the prying eyes of any future technology. I thought of the one place my grandfather had deemed secure enough for his own terrible secrets. I took a shovel and walked back to the clearing. The cairn was still there, the moss and ivy having woven a gentle shroud over the concrete rubble. It was a sacred place, a grave, and it felt like a violation to disturb it. But it was also the epicenter of everything. The ground here was already scarred, its secrets already spilled. I chose a spot at the head of the cairn, between two gnarled roots of the oldest oak. I dug deep, down past the soft topsoil into the hard, cold clay. I placed the objects in a small, waterproof metal case I had brought and buried it, packing the earth back down with a solemn finality. Let their satellites scan this place. Let them find only the bones of the past. When I returned to the house, Celeste was waiting for me. She took one look, had my dirt-stained hands, and knew. "It's done?" she asked. I nodded. We didn't speak of it again. We focused on the present, on Ilara's birthday. We filled the house with laughter and friends, a deliberate, defiant act of normalcy. The party was a success. But as the last guest left, Ilara, her face smudged with cake, looked up at me with those serious eyes. "The quiet man is sad," she said. "He says the bad men are digging." A cold dread, sharper than any I had felt since the night of the beast, seized me. They weren't just watching. They were acting. I drove to the edge of our property, the one that bordered the deep woods. There, barely visible from the road, was a freshly cut access path. And at the end of that path, I saw them. The men in suits were not alone. They had a small team with ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors. They were scanning the earth, looking for the foundation of the lab, for any buried metal, for any anomaly. They were digging up the past, and they were getting closer. I returned home, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I told Celeste everything. The peace we had built, the life we had carved out, was crumbling around us. We were caught between two forces, the corporate predators who wanted to dissect the miracle, and the silent watchers in the woods who held the key to a truth we could barely comprehend. And our daughter was the bridge between them all. That night I sat by Ilara's bedside, watching her sleep. The moon cast a silver path across her floor, much like it had on so many other nights. But this time, the silence outside her window was broken not by a monster's growl, but by the soft, deliberate crunch of a footstep on the gravel path below. I moved to the window and looked down. Standing in the moonlight, looking not at the house but at Ilara's window, was the tall, slender figure. This time, I saw him clearly. He was humanoid, but his proportions were subtly wrong, his limbs too long, his posture too still. His skin seemed to reflect the moonlight like polished stone, and his eyes, when they met mine, were the same shade of deep, knowing amber that I remembered from a lifetime ago. He did not speak. He simply raised one long-fingered hand, palm open, in a gesture that was neither a threat nor a greeting, but an invitation. Then he turned and walked back toward the woods, vanishing into the shadows between the trees. He had not come for the artifacts. He had not come to warn us about the men. He had come for Ilara. The next chapter was beginning, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that we could no longer stand on the sidelines. We had to choose a side and follow. I did not wake Celeste. I pulled on my boots and a heavy jacket, my movements slow and deliberate, as if I were moving through deep water. I scribbled a note and left it on the kitchen table. Gone for a walk. Back soon. The lie felt flimsy, a paper shield against the storm I was walking into. I paused at the door to Ilara's room, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. She was the quiet at the center of the coming hurricane. The woods were different at night when you were seeking the strange, instead of fearing it. The darkness was not oppressive, but full of a subtle guiding energy. I did not need a path. I followed a feeling, a pull in my chest, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the roots of my teeth. It was the same sensation I had felt near the metal box all those years ago, but now it was clean, clarified, an open channel instead of a distorted signal. I found him waiting for me in the same clearing where we had buried the brothers. He stood by the cairn, one of his long, graceful hands resting on the moss-covered stone. In the full moonlight, I could see him properly. His skin had a faint, pearlescent sheen, and his hair was like a cap of spun silver. He was alien, yet the intelligence in his amber eyes was familiar and deeply weary. "You are the grandfather," he said. His voice was not a sound heard by the ear, but a resonance that formed directly in my mind. It was calm and ancient. "I am," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "I am Kalen. The name, our name for the wooden bird, settled between us. It was not a code name. It was who he was. The one you called Lysander was my scout, my son. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The grief I had carried for the small, brave creature was now shaded with a deeper, more profound sorrow. I had held a dying son in my arms without knowing it. He spoke of you," Kalen continued, his mental voice softening with a memory. "He said your kindness was a light in the silence. He broke protocol for you. He could not bear the suffering his brother was causing." "The men are back," I said, steering us toward the immediate, terrifying present. "They are digging. They know." Kalen nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Their instruments are crude, but effective. They will find the foundation soon. They will find the resonance. They believe it is a power source to be harnessed. They are wrong." He looked toward the eastern edge of the clearing, where the new access path cut through the trees. "It is a gateway, a fragile one. My son's presence here, and the abomination that was created from him, damaged its integrity. The energy they detect is a wound, bleeding through dimensions." The full scope of the danger finally crystallized. It wasn't just about corporate espionage or biological weapons. It was about a rupture in reality itself. "What do you want with Alara?" I asked, the question torn from me. A genuine sadness flowed from him. "We do not want her. She is drawn to the resonance. She is a sensitive, a bridge. Your bloodline, through your grandfather's exposure, has become attuned. The men will discover this. They will see her not as a child, but as a component, a key." He took a step toward me, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of urgency from him. "You cannot stop them alone. Their resolve has hardened. They will take what they want. Us? Then, what are we supposed to do?" I asked, desperation clawing at my throat. "You must cross," Kalen said, his amber eyes holding mine. "You, your mate, your child. You must step through the gateway before they can stabilize it from this side. On our side, we can seal it. Permanently." He was asking us to leave our world, our home, our entire lives. To vanish into the unknown to protect two worlds from a catastrophe of my grandfather's making. The weight of the choice was immense, paralyzing. "And if we stay," I whispered, "then you will be taken, studied. Your daughter will become a specimen. And when they force the gateway open, they will not find a power source. They will find a civilization that will have no choice but to defend itself. The conflict will not be with bullets. It will be with concepts your world is not equipped to understand. It will be an extinction. It will be an extinction." The word hung in the air, final and absolute. There was no choice. There was only necessity. I looked back toward the house, toward the light in our bedroom window. Celeste was awake. I could feel it. She was waiting for me to return with the truth that would break our world and build a new one. go, Kalen said, his form beginning to shimmer at the edges, blending with the moonlight. Prepare. Bring only what you can carry. The time of hiding is over. The time of crossing is near. I turned and ran, not from the woods, but toward what I had to do. I had to tell my wife we were leaving our world behind. I had to wake my daughter and tell her we were going on a trip to see the quiet man. The gravel of the road crunched under my feet, a frantic, rushing sound in the quiet night, the sound of a life unraveling and a new, terrifying story beginning. Story 4. The chair stood in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel woven from shadow and old wood. It was an ordinary thing, a ladder-back chair with a cane seat that had long ago begun to sag and fray at the edges. It held no particular history, no famous maker's mark, no memory of a beloved ancestor. It was simply a chair. Yet, in the thin, antiseptic light of the sick room, it seemed to possess a density the other objects lacked, a gravity that pulled at the eye. It was the first thing Cash saw upon waking, and the last shape his eyes traced before the morphine pulled his mother under. He was 13, and the chair was his anchor in the long, slow dissolve of his world. His mother, Cassandra, was a sketch of herself, a woman rendered in translucent paper and bird bone. The cancer was a quiet, insatiable guest, consuming her from the inside out. It left a smell in the room, a sweet, cloying odor of decay that clung to the back of the throat, a scent the pine-scented disinfectants could not hope to conquer. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, the floorboards settling with the sigh of a terminal patient, the wind outside whispering through the pines with a conspiratorial hush. It began with the chair, as most things did. One evening, as Cash changed the cold compress on his mother's forehead, he saw something from the corner of his eye. The chair was not empty. For a fraction of a second, a figure sat there, composed of the room's deepening gloom, its form indistinct but its posture one of immense patience, as if it had been waiting for a very long time. When Cash turned his head, it was gone, leaving only the impression of a presence, a cold spot in the air that made the fine hairs on his arms stand erect. That night, the visions started. They were not dreams. They were too vivid, too coherent in their own bizarre geometry. He was standing in a vast gray plain under a bruised twilight sky where two moons, one a sickly yellow, the other a pale, dead white, hung like unblinking eyes. The air was thin and cold, carrying the taste of rust and static. In the distance, jagged spires of black rock clawed at the heavens, and things moved in the canyons between them. Things that were little more than shifts of shadow and a skittering, chitinous sound. He felt a profound cellular pull, a sense that this place, this other world, was a reflection of his own, a negative image on the same strip of film. And he knew with a certainty that bypassed logic that the thing that was killing his mother was here, a malignancy that had leaked from that reality into this one. He told no one. Grief and fear were doing strange things to everyone, the nurses said with sympathetic, condescending smiles. But then the man came. His name was Darian, and he appeared at the door one rain-lashed afternoon, a mountain of a man in a long, dark coat, his face a roadmap of old scars and older sorrows. He did not knock so much as announce his presence with a single, solid thud of his fist against the wood. He looked at Cash, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no pity, only a grim assessment. "She is failing," Darian said, his voice a low rumble. "The blight has its roots in the other place. It is feeding on her here, but its heart is there. You can see it, can't you? The gray land, the twin moons." Cash could only nod, a cold dread and a colder hope warring in his chest. "I am your guide, your protector," Darian continued. "Your mother was a warden, a guardian of the threshold. The balance is broken. The things that gnaw at the foundations of the world are waking. They seek to extinguish her light, and through her, open the way. You have her sight. You must come with me." There was no discussion, no tearful goodbye. Cassandra was mostly unconscious, her breath a faint flutter. Cash wrote a note and left it on the kitchen table, a lie about staying with a friend. It felt flimsy, a paper boat set on a raging ocean. He followed Darian into the rain, and the journey began. It was not a journey across states, but through them. Darian drove an old, boxy truck that smelled of oil and earth. But the roads he took were not always on any map. Sometimes, the world would soften at the edges, the asphalt shimmering like a mirage, the pine trees twisting into grotesque weeping shapes. The air would grow thin and cold, and the second moon would appear in the sky, a baleful companion to the one Cash had always known. They were traveling in the seams between the worlds, the fragile places where the wallpaper of reality had begun to peel. The dark forces pursued them. They were not monsters one could shoot or outrun, not entirely. They were manifestations of entropy, of a cosmic indifference that sought to unmake order and return all to a silent, gray sameness. In this world they were felt as a pervasive sense of dread, a streak of bad luck, a truck that nearly ran them off a mountain pass. In the other world, they had form. The Whisperers were the most common, pale, slender things that flickered at the periphery of vision, their voices a susurrus of forgotten fears and private shames that coiled directly into the mind. Then there were the Grinders, hulking, tectonic shapes that moved through the stone, their passage causing the very earth to tremble. Darian fought them with tools that were part weapon, part ritual. He carried a long, weighted knife that seemed to drink the light, and he would chant in a low, guttural language that made Kasha's teeth ache. The fights were not glorious. They were desperate, brutal affairs of misdirection and sudden, shocking violence. Darian would bleed, not always red, and the wounds he inflicted seemed to bleed a thick, black ichor that evaporated into a foul-smelling smoke. During a lull, holed up in a derelict motel on the edge of a desert that existed in both worlds, Darian explained, "The war is not between good and evil as you think of it. It is between pattern and chaos, meaning and void. Your mother is a nexus, a point of intense coherence. Her love for you, her life, it creates a pattern so strong it holds the chaos at bay. They want to snuff it out, to prove that nothing matters, that all order eventually falls to dust." Kasha's own strength began to manifest. It was a quiet power, not of violence, but of perception and connection. He could find the weak spots in the fabric between worlds, the hidden paths and quiet glades where the light of his own world still pooled. He could feel the life force of things, the vibrant green pulse of a resilient weed cracking through asphalt, the fading ember of a small, dead animal by the roadside. He learned to draw on these tiny, defiant sparks of existence to fortify himself, to push back against the chilling nihilism of the Whisperers. They encountered other figures, mystical and ephemeral. An old woman who lived in a railroad car at the end of a forgotten spur line, her eyes milky with cataracts that saw not this world, but the swirling currents of the other. She offered them bitter tea in a single smooth river stone. "Wow. The stone," she said, "is a memory of the earth. It remembers when it was fire and when it was dust. Hold it when you forget why you fight." In the other world, she appeared as a towering being of woven light and root, a guardian of memory. The journey was an accumulation of weariness and wonder, of terror and a strange burgeoning beauty. Kashi's love for his mother, once a simple, aching boy's love, became a thing of immense complexity, a cosmic principle he was carrying across a desolate landscape. It was a weight that threatened to crush him, and a shield that made him invincible. The final leg of the journey led them to a place that was the heart of the blight in both worlds. In reality, it was an abandoned, monolithic hydroelectric dam, a concrete curve holding back a vast, dark reservoir. In the other world, it was the same structure, but twisted. A necrotic altar from which black, root-like tendrils pulsed into the poisoned earth and sickly sky. This was the source. This was where the thing that fed on his mother had its heart. "We cannot both go," Darien said, his face grim. "The way is too narrow. It must be you, Cash. Only your connection to her can find the core. I will hold the gate." The gate was the dam's main access tunnel, a yawning mouth of darkness that exhaled a breath of freezing air and the sound of a million whispers. As Cash approached, the shadows congealed, and the whisperers and grinders manifested in force, a tide of anti-life rushing to defend their prize. Darien gave Cash one last, long look, then turned to face the horde, his knife held high, his voice rising in a war chant that was both prayer and curse. Cash ran out. The interior of the dam was a cathedral of industrial decay, a labyrinth of rusted catwalks and cavernous machinery halls. The other world overlay like a phantom limb, the concrete sweating a black, oily substance, the air thick with the buzzing of invisible flies. He followed the pull in his blood, the faint, golden thread that was his mother's life, a thread that grew thinner and more frayed with every step. He found it in the central control room. Here, the two worlds merged completely. The banks of dead dials and switches were also pulsating organic nodes, and in the center of the room, hanging in the air like a cancerous star, was the core of the blight. It was a complex, swirling knot of darkness, and at its very center, he could see a faint, fading image of his mother's face, serene in her sleep, being slowly consumed. The whisperers were here too, not as flickers, but as a solid wall of pale, grasping forms, their collective voice a physical pressure. "You are our dust. She is dust. All love is a temporary arrangement of molecules. Let it go. Let the quiet take you." Cash felt the despair wash over him, cold and heavy. It was all true. He was a boy in a giant, dead machine, fighting against the inevitable tide of the universe. He was nothing. Then he felt the river's stone, warm in his pocket. He thought of the weed breaking the asphalt. He thought of Darien's scarred face, fighting a war he could never win, because the fight itself was the meaning. He thought of his mother's hand, cool on his fevered brow years ago. A simple, ordinary gesture, charged with an infinite love. He did not attack the darkness. He did not fight it. He simply remembered. He remembered the smell of rain on hot pavement, the taste of his mother's apple pie, the sound of her laughter, the weight of the family dog sleeping on his feet. He gathered every small, insignificant, beautiful memory of a life lived in the light, and he let them fill it. He became a vessel not for power, but for pattern, for meaning. He walked toward the swirling knot of nothingness, and as he did, a light began to emanate from him, a soft, gold light that held no heat, only a profound sense of order. It was the light of a remembered birthday, a finished homework assignment, a shared secret. It was the light of a chair in a quiet room, simply being there, holding its space in the world. The darkness recoiled. It had no defense against this. It could unravel terror and amplify despair, but it could not comprehend the quiet, stubborn defiance of a boy's love for his mother. The whispers became screams of static, then faded into silence. The knot unraveled, not with a bang, but with a sigh, dissipating like smoke in a strong wind. The image of his mother's face glowed brightly for a moment, and she smiled, a real, conscious smile before it too faded. The epilogue was not a celebration. Cash emerged from the dam to find Darian leaning against the concrete, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his breath ragged but alive. The sun was rising, painting the reservoir in hues of rose and gold. They did not speak. They drove back in a silence that was not empty, but full. Cassandra lived. The doctors called it a miracle, a spontaneous remission they could not explain. She grew stronger, the color returning to her cheeks, the light to her eyes. The house lost its smell of sickness, though the chair in the corner remained, just a chair once more. Cash was different. He had seen the scaffolding behind the world. He knew the war was not over, that it would never be over. He was a soldier now in a conflict no one else could see. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would go to the window and see the second moon, a pale sliver in the sky, a reminder. He would feel the immense, silent struggle in the spaces between things. And so the boy returned, and the mother was saved, and the protector stood watch. The story, like all such stories, is both an ending and a beginning. It is a record of a single defiant point of light that refused to be extinguished. It is a testament to the fact that, in the face of the infinite, meaningless dark, the simple, ordinary act of loving another person is the most powerful and the most terrifying magic of all. The balance was restored for now, but the watchers in the twilight know that the scales are always trembling, and the light of one brave soul is all that stands between the world you know and the endless, hungry gray. They are watching still. They are always watching. The new normal was a fragile construct, a pane of glass carefully fitted over a broken window. Cash went back to school, to homework and cafeteria food, and the distant chatter of classmates, whose biggest concerns were pop quizzes and who liked who. He moved through it all with a quiet detachment, a 13-year-old ghost in a world that had forgotten how to be solid. He loved his mother with a ferocity that was now tinged with a profound, unspoken grief, for he had seen the cost of her life, a price paid in a currency of shadows. He visited Darian sometimes. The man lived in a small Spartan cabin deep in the state forest, a place that existed firmly in the seam between worlds. The air there was always still and carried the scent of ozone and pine. Darian taught him things, not as a master to a student, but as one soldier to another. How to focus his sight to perceive the subtle stresses in reality. How to listen, not with his ears, but with his mind, for the dissonant hum of a whisperer's approach. How to use the riverstone, not just as a comfort, but as a lens to ground himself in the deep, slow time of the earth. It was during one of these lessons that the second sign came. They were standing by a creek, and Darian was showing him how to read the flow of energy in the water, the way it carried echoes of life from upstream. Suddenly, a kingfisher dove from a branch, a brilliant flash of blue and orange, and speared a small fish from the current. It was an ordinary, brutal, beautiful moment of life. But as the bird rose, a shadow fell across it. Not a cloud, but a sudden, localized dimming of the light. The kingfisher froze in midair, its form flickering, becoming translucent. For a single, heart-stopping second, Cash saw through it to the trees on the other side, as if the bird were a photograph fading from existence. Then the moment passed. The shadow vanished. The kingfisher gave a startled cry, dropped its fish, and fled. Darian's hand was on his knife, his eyes scanning the canopy. He said nothing for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. They are not just attacking points of light anymore. They are testing the weave itself, trying to unravel the pattern of existence, thread by thread. That night, Cash lay in his bed, the familiar walls of his room feeling thin as paper. He thought of the kingfisher, its brief flicker toward nothingness. He thought of his mother, laughing in the kitchen as she tried a new recipe, the sound of bright, golden thread in the tapestry. He understood then that his fight was not over. It had just changed. He was not just a guardian of people, but of moments. Of the kingfisher's dive, of his mother's laugh, of the simple, profound fact of a thing continuing to be. He got out of bed and walked to the window. The second moon was there, as always, a pale, watchful sliver. But tonight, he saw something new. A single star, close to the phantom moon, was blinking. It pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a signal. It was not a friendly light. It was a cold, insistent pinprick of observation, a needle probing the fabric of the sky. Cash felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The war was not in some distant, blighted dam. It was here, in his sky, over his town. The balance was trembling again, and the silent, watching things had just made their presence known in a new and more intimate way. He stood there until dawn, a sentinel at his own window, guarding the fragile night. The blinking star did not fade with the dawn. It remained, a faint, persistent scar on the blue canvas of day, visible only to him. He had to point it out to his mother over breakfast, gesturing vaguely toward the eastern sky. She followed his gaze, squinting, and then smiled, ruffling his hair. Just a plane, sweetheart, or maybe a satellite. Her touch was warm, alive, but it felt separated from him by a pane of that same glass. He nodded and ate his toast, the lie a bitter crust in his mouth. The world began to fray at the edges, in small and insidious ways. A crack in the sidewalk he was sure hadn't been there the day before would seem to deepen as he looked at it, revealing not dirt, but a glimpse of an impossible gray vastness. The drone of the school intercom would sometimes dissolve into a wave of static that formed words, his name, whispered in a chorus of dry, ancient voices. He was the only one who heard it. He learned to keep his face still, a mask of ordinary boyhood, while inside he was building fortifications. He went back to Darian's cabin after school, the need for guidance a physical ache. He found the man not by the creek, but inside, packing a worn leather satchel. His movements were efficient, tense. He did not look up as Cash entered. "You saw it," Darian stated. It was not a question. "The signal. What does it mean?" Cash asked, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. "It means a new kind of breach," Darian said, stuffing a coil of silver wire into the bag. "Not a tier for the grinders to push through, or a thin spot for the whisperers to exploit. This is a pinpoint, an insertion. Something is coming through, not to consume or destroy from the outside, but to replace, to wear our world like a skin." A cold dread, different from any he had felt before, settled in Cash's stomach. The thing in the dam was a beast of overt hunger. This was a thief, a doppelganger. "Where?" Cash asked. Darian finally looked at him, and the sorrow in his winter sky eyes was deeper than ever. "It's drawn to stability, to strong, simple patterns. It will seek a fixed point, a life of routine, and minimal complexity to mimic and then overwrite." Their eyes met, and the same, unspoken understanding passed between them. The old woman, the one who lived in the railroad car. She was a fixed point, a guardian of memory, but her life was a perfect, solitary pattern. She was a beacon. They drove as the sun bled out behind the hills. Darian did not use the hidden roads this time. There was no need for stealth, only speed. The air in the truck was thick with a shared, frantic energy. When they reached the forgotten spur line, the sky was the color of lead, and the first drops of a cold rain began to fall. The railroad car was dark, the silence around it absolute. No wind stirred the tall grass. It was the silence of a held breath. The door was ajar. Inside, the small space was in disarray. The kettle was overturned, the bedclothes torn. And in the center of the room, standing where the old woman usually sat in her rocker, was a figure. It wore her shawl, her shape, but it was wrong. Its edges were too sharp, its stillness too complete. It turned, and its face was a pale, smooth mask, devoid of wrinkles or expression. Where its eyes should have been were two voids that held the same cold, blinking light as the star. It spoke, and its voice was a perfect hollow replica of the old woman's, but stripped of all warmth and history. "The memory of the earth is a lie," it said. "All stones return to dust. There is only the silence." Darian moved first, his knife flashing, but the thing flowed around the attack like smoke. It was not there to fight. It was there to exist, and its mere existence was an act of erasure. Cash felt the world around him growing thin, the vibrant history of the place. The old woman's memories, her guardianship, her bitter tea and kindness, being scoured away, replaced by a sterile, gray nullity. He fell to his knees, clutching the river stone in his pocket. He tried to remember the old woman's face, her woven light form in the other world, but the memories slipped away like water through his fingers, stolen by the thing's pervasive emptiness. He was failing. The pattern was dissolving. Then his fingers, clenched around the stone, felt a new sensation. It was not just warmth. It was a vibration, a low, resonant hum that seemed to sync with the frantic beating of his own heart. He wasn't just holding a memory. He was holding a piece of the world, a thing that had witnessed epochs. He pressed the stone against the rough wooden floor of the railroad car. He did not push his memories out. Instead, he asked the stone for its own. He felt a jolt, a torrent of sensation that was not his, the crushing pressure of deep time, the slow grind of glaciers, the fierce, brief joy of a spring thaw, the patient, endless cycle of it all. It was a pattern vaster and more enduring than any single life. He channeled that immense geological stability into the floorboards, into the air, into the very concept of this place. The thing wherein the old woman's shawl flinched. The blinking in its void eyes stuttered. It was an agent of the end of all things, but the earth had no end, only change. It was a lie in the face of a deeper, more ancient truth. "You are a temporary arrangement," Cash thought, pouring the stone's memory into the void. The stone remains. With a sound like shattering ice, the smooth mask of its face cracked. A glimpse of the true, swirling nothingness beneath showed through. It let out a hiss of pure static and then collapsed inward upon itself, vanishing and taking the unnatural silence with it. The railroad car was just a railroad car again, cold and empty. The old woman was gone, truly gone this time, but her memory was safe. The place remembered her. Cash, trembling, pulled the stone from his pocket. It was cool now, inert. He had used up the memory she had given him. Darian helped him to his feet. "The fight is changing, Cash," he said, his voice heavy. "We are not just fighting monsters. We are fighting ideas. We are fighting against being forgotten." Cash looked out the open door at the falling rain. The blinking star was gone from the sky, but he knew it was only a retreat, not a defeat. The war for the world had become a war for its soul, for every memory, every moment, every stone. And he was now a soldier on that new, invisible front. The rain fell in steady gray sheets as they drove away from the railroad spur. The victory felt hollow, a casket buried in mud. The old woman was gone, and with her, a piece of the world's memory. Cash stared at the river stone in his palm, now just a cold, gray pebble. It felt like a part of him had been carved out and used as fuel. He didn't go home. He couldn't face the warmth of his mother's kitchen, the ordinary love that now felt like a precious, fragile artifact in a museum of things that were being systematically stolen. He had Darian drop him off at the edge of the town park. "I need to walk," he said. Darian simply nodded, the understanding between them now a language of its own. The park was deserted, the playground equipment slick and dark with rain. Cash walked aimlessly, his sneakers sinking into the soft grass. He felt the other world pressing in, not as a hostile force, but as a constant, draining presence. The buzzing in the air was back, a low-level static that frayed his nerves. He found himself standing by the old stone fountain, long since turned off for the season. The basin was filled with rainwater and dead leaves. He looked at the water, at the perfect, concentric circles made by the falling rain. Then he focused, the way Darian had taught him. He looked for the stress points, the frayed edges, and he saw it. A single leaf, a brilliant maple red, was caught in a tiny, impossible eddy. Instead of floating, it was vibrating, its color flickering between vibrant red and a dull, ashen gray. It was being unmade, right in front of him. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone else, but to Cash it was a scream in a silent world. A hand fell on his shoulder. He jumped, spinning around to see Mr. Alden, his history teacher, holding a folded newspaper over his head against the rain. "Everything all right, Cash? You're soaked through." Mr. Alden's face was kind, lined with the gentle concern of a man who spent his life with teenagers. But his eyes were wrong. They held a flat, polished sheen, like river stones worn smooth by a current that had no life in it. The concern in his voice was a perfect recording, but it did not reach his eyes. "I'm fine," Cash mumbled, taking a step back. The buzzing in the air intensified, centering on the teacher. "You look pale," Mr. Alden said, his smile not shifting a millimeter. "The midterm on the Industrial Revolution isn't that scary, I promise. All that coal and steel. It's just the story of how we built this world." He gestured vaguely at the town around them. "But it's all temporary, isn't it? Dust to dust. All these struggles, these little lives, they don't really leave a mark." The words were benign, teacherly, but they carried the same hollow resonance as the thing in the railroad car. They were an attack, subtle and insidious, on the very idea of meaning. Cash's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the new war. It wasn't in blighted dams or forgotten railroad cars. It was here, in the park, in his teacher. The thing wasn't just replacing people. It was replacing their ideas, their roles, twisting them into agents of quiet despair. "They leave a mark," Cash said, his voice trembling but clear. "They have to." Mr. Alden's smooth smile held. "Why?" he asked, the single word dripping with a cold, logical poison. Cash had no answer that would make sense to this thing. He couldn't fight it with a river stone or memories. Not here. He just took another step back, then turned and walked away, feeling the polished, lifeless gaze on his back until he turned the corner. He knew then that the battlefield was everywhere. School, the store, his own street. The enemy was no longer a shadow monster. It was a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a lesson that taught futility, a quiet, spreading stain of nothingness wearing the skin of his world. And he was the only one who could see it. He walked until the rain soaked through his jacket and his teeth began to chatter. The cold was a relief, a sensation so purely, brutally physical that it grounded him. Mr. Alden. How long had he been that way? Had the real Mr. Alden, the one who'd gotten genuinely excited about the printing press and its impact on democracy, been taken during a quiet evening grading papers? Or was it a slower process, a gradual hollowing out that no one had noticed? He found himself outside his own house. The lights were on in the living room, casting a warm yellow glow onto the wet street. His mother's silhouette moved past the window. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever seen. Was she still his mother? The thought was a spike of ice in his chest. He stood in the shadow of a large oak tree, watching, a spy in his own life. He looked for the signs Darian had taught him, the slight flicker at the edges, the dissonant hum. He saw nothing but the familiar, comforting shape of his mother watering her plants. He heard nothing but the faint, muffled sound of the television. It was all so normal. And that was the problem. The enemy was a master of the normal. He finally forced himself to go inside. The warmth of the house felt like a trap. "Gosh, you're drenched." His mother emerged from the living room, her face etched with real concern. She came forward and put a hand on his wet cheek. Her touch was warm. It was her. It had to be. "I'm okay, Mom. Just went for a walk." "In this weather? You'll catch your death." She frowned, her eyes searching his. "You've been so distant lately. Is everything all right at school, with your friends?" He looked into her eyes. They were the same shade of hazel they had always been, flecked with green and gold. They held warmth and worry and love. There was no polished, flat sheen, no void. This was his mother. The realization was a wave of such profound relief that he almost crumpled. He threw his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of her laundry detergent and perfume. "I love you, Mom," he mumbled into her sweater. She held him tightly, a little surprised by the intensity. "I love you too, sweetheart, so much." She pulled back, her hands on his shoulders. "Now, go get out of those wet clothes. I made soup." He did as he was told. The simple, domestic order, a lifeline. But as he changed into dry pajamas in his room, the fear returned, colder and more sophisticated now. What if they were waiting for him to let his guard down? What if their strategy was to leave the most important things untouched, to make him question his own sanity, to make him the unstable one, a boy who saw monsters in his teachers and heard whispers in the static? He went downstairs and ate the soup. It was chicken and rice, his favorite. He told his mother about a project at school, crafting the lie with meticulous care. He talked about friends who weren't really his friends anymore, about teachers who weren't Mr. Alden. He built a fortress of normalcy around the dinner table, and she smiled, believing him. Later, in the sanctity of his room, he took out a blank notebook. He opened it to the first page. He did not write about grinders or whisperers or blinking stars. He wrote down the memory of the kingfisher's dive, in as much detail as he could recall. The flash of blue, the splash, the fish wriggling in its beak. He wrote about the exact sound of his mother's laugh from the kitchen earlier that evening. He wrote about the feeling of the river stone when it was full of memory, and the feeling of it when it was empty. It was his new weapon. If the enemy fought with erasure, he would fight with record. He would be a scribe, an archivist of moments. He would anchor them not just in his mind, but on paper, in ink. It was a feeble defense against an infinite, hungry gray, but it was something. It was a declaration. He would remember. He would bear witness. And as long as one person remembered, the world, its beautiful, fragile, temporary world, was not yet lost. The next morning, the world outside his window looked deceptively clean and whole. The rain had washed everything, leaving the streets dark and the leaves a brilliant, wet green. He walked to school with his notebook tucked securely in his backpack, his hand occasionally brushing against the canvas to feel its solid presence. The buzzing was still there, a constant, low-grade headache at the edge of his perception. He saw Mr. Alden in the hallway before first period. The teacher was sipping coffee from a mug, discussing the baseball game from the night before with another teacher. His laugh was a perfect, hearty sound. Cash watched the way his colleagues interacted with him with easy familiarity. They saw nothing wrong. To them, he was just Mr. Alden. The thing, the replacement, had woven itself seamlessly into the pattern of their lives. It was protected by their perception of it. Kash's history class was a special kind of torture. He took his usual seat, his notebook open on his desk. Mr. Alden began the lesson, his voice the same calm, measured tone it had always been. He spoke about the Luddites, the weavers who smashed the mechanical looms that threatened their way of life. They were fighting progress, of course, Mr. Alden said, pacing slowly at the front of the room. But you can understand their fear. They saw their entire world, their skills, their community, being rendered obsolete. They were trying to hold back the tide. He paused, his smooth gaze sweeping over the classroom. But the tide always wins. All structures, no matter how beloved, are temporary. The machines replaced them. Their struggle was, in the grand scheme, a footnote. A fleeting moment of resistance against the inevitable. The words were textbook, but the subtext was a venomous whisper. Your efforts are meaningless. Your resistance is a footnote. Cash's pen trembled in his hand. He looked down at his notebook. He didn't write notes about the Luddites. Instead, he wrote a single sentence, pressing the ink deep into the paper. Mr. Alden's coffee mug has a small chip on the handle. It was a fact. A tiny, insignificant, true thing. It was an anchor. After class, he lingered, letting the other students file out. Mr. Alden was erasing the whiteboard. "Can I help you, Cash?" he asked without turning around. "I had a question," Cash said, his voice steady. "About the Luddites." Mr. Alden turned, his polite smile in place. "Of course. You said their struggle was a footnote. But isn't the point that they struggled? That they cared enough to try? Doesn't that matter?" The thing wearing Mr. Alden's skin regarded him. The polished eyes showed no irritation, no intellectual engagement, only a patient, condescending stillness. It matters as a historical curiosity, a symptom, but the outcome was never in doubt. The machines were stronger. Their way of life was erased. That is the nature of change. It is a force of forgetting. Cash's fingers tightened on the strap of his backpack. He wanted to shout, to throw his notebook at that smooth, placid face. Instead, he said, "My mom has a quilt her great-grandmother made. It's falling apart, but we still have it." Mr. Alden's smile didn't falter. "A sentimental artifact. It doesn't keep anyone warm anymore, does it? Its utility is gone. It's just a memory of a memory." The dismissal was absolute. Cash simply nodded and left. In the hallway, he leaned against the cool metal of the lockers, his heart pounding. He took out his notebook. He wrote, "The chip on the mug is on the left side." He was building his arsenal, one tiny stubborn truth at a time. He knew he couldn't argue with the thing. It spoke the language of cold, hard facts, of entropy and endings. He had to speak a different language altogether. He had to speak the language of the kingfisher's dive, of the chip on a coffee mug, of a mother's laugh. It was the only language the silence could not understand. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales. And to help our channel grow, wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.